Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became Eraserhead Part 3. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see Part 4, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story Apprentice of InsomNyaC from 𝐬𝐻. So let's start the video. Kyoka had turned the radio on that night out of years of habit. It was 7 o'clock on a Friday night, and those couple hours every week that followed had been a constant for her whole actively remembered life. One of her first memories was of her father excitedly tuning into the Put Your Hands Up broadcast, wanting to hear the song from his new album's radio debut. Present mics and loud clouds voices had been a constant in her life every Friday since. But now her two biggest heroes and influences were on the run as suspected villains in league with her now former homeroom teacher. Obviously, there was not going to be a broadcast tonight with the whole of rooftop radio under investigation. However, before she could switch the radio back off, she was surprised by the static of a dead station being replaced with a very familiar intro tune that was quickly drowned out by a familiar laugh. Hey there listeners, you miss us. This is the artist formerly known as Present Mic coming to you live from our brand new pirate radio studio. Another familiar laugh. Reverb, I don't think we can really call this a new studio. I am pretty sure this place is older than we are combined. Hey now 𝐀𝐦, new to us is still new. Who cares if the roof might leak like crazy and there is probably a dead body bricked up in a wall or something given who owns the place? We're doing radio. A third unexpected but frankly probably should have been expected voice cut in. Pops, I doubt grandfather would have seriously stuffed a body in a wall of his own safe house to get rid of it. He probably has people for that. Pops, wait. When they had realized that Cloud Sensei was not actually coming back with Midoriya Sensei and All Might, the class had assumed that ♀had been kidnapped for his quirk to be used by the newly revealed villains. But what if the reason he had been grabbed had been the same as that of Midoriya? And the rest of Midoriya Sensei's family had vanished. Was ♀ actually Mike Sensei's kid? She pulled up the class chat and it everyone about the broadcast. Oh, you're no fun siren. Why'd you have to be so straightforward and logical as your dad 10? We're on the run from the law. Live a little. Oh, huh. She had always thought Present Mic and Loud Cloud were actually secretly a thing from how they talked with one another, but if Midoriya Sensei was 10 and ♀'s father did that mean that Mike Sensei had been actually in a relationship of sorts with Midoriya Sensei behind the scenes and Cloud Sensei had just been a close friend the whole time? On the radio, ♀ huffed. I am just saying that grandfather hasn't actually been caught by the heroes before for a reason. He has a point. Reverb. All for One hasn't exactly been kicking around since the dawn of quirks by being bad at being a villain. I think that fight he had to be bailed out of by 10 just a few years back with All Might was probably the only time he even came close to it, and that only happened because he made the small mistake of assuming that disemboweling the guy would stop him like any normal human being. Mike, or well Reverb now she supposed, made a noise of disgust. Really 𝐀𝐦, you know that people listen to our broadcast while eating, right? Things devolved from there to their more usual radio antics with the new addition of ♀. When it became clear that they were back to their regularly scheduled programming, she began to read over the class chat to be greeted with a shock. Class 1 official ♀. At Gyro O'Cool wasn't sure if any of you guys were listening. Kirishima. Monoma, wait, why is he still here if he has actually gone full villain on us? ♀, you realize that my dad is the one who made the chat and is the only one with admin powers in here, right? The only reason that neither Izuku or I have been online in here up until now is because grandfather is keeping us under a communication blackout at the real safe house. I can only message now because by the time the heroes trace the broadcast with all the relay equipment, we will be long gone again. Gyro, ♀, what the hell is going on? ♀, long version or short? Ada, I think I speak for most of us when I say we would like the full story. ♀, MK, but you asked for it. Basically the guy who appeared in the 𝐬𝐻 to attack us is a clone like dad of the S++ supervillain All for One who has been around for a while. Grandfather's quirk lets him give and take the quirks of others, and the guy who made the clones was trying to create one with his quirk, only All for One is not very good about being passed down genetically due to the high rate of mutation caused by it, so dad is the only one of those 10 clones that got it. I actually a clone of dad that we think the doctor made in a hope of getting around the mutation chance that he abandoned when my hair came out purple, since obviously I mutated too, but we are not actually sure since the timeline is sort of sketch. There it was something we were planning to question 6 about when we finally found him, but obvious that did not end up happening since grandfather is more a force of nature at this point than a human being. Dad was trying to keep him under control by keeping him distracted from villainy that was actually working pretty well, all things considered. Before all of this happened, still my Uncle 9 has not been doing Dad any favors by running around hyping him up as the next big bad villain after Grandfather, when up until the Dad normally avoided the villain stuff like the plague. Of course, knowing that, my other dads sort of realized they need contingency plans for when everything eventually crashed and burned. 𝐻𝐡𝐬, dads plural, 𝗫𝐸, yeah. Dad married both of them a couple years before they found me. 𝐴𝐷𝐻, I believe she was more asking about who they were. 𝗫𝐸. Oh, I thought that was obvious, especially if you guys are listening to the broadcast right now. 𝐾𝐦 tune back into hear reverb dramatically whining to 𝗫𝐸 to get his radio partner to stop bullying him. 𝗫𝐸 just deadpanned. Pops, Odo-san isn't wrong. Of the three of you, you are by far the worst cook. Gasp. Attacked by my own husband and now our son. I miss 10. He is always nice to me. Kurogiri chuckled. Now that is just a blatant lie reverb. 10 is literally the most brutally honest of us. He is the entire reason we have a cat named Bastard. Remember, Class 1 official 𝐻𝐡𝐬. Damn 𝗫𝐸. That was cold. Be nicer to your poor pops, 𝗫𝐸. Damn ghostwriting for my pops now. You have never tried eating pops' attempts at cooking before. I swear the man can burn water. 𝐻𝐡𝐬. I think we are missing the most important part of all of this. Present Mike, Loud Cloud, and Midoriya Sensei were all married to one another with at least one cat, 𝗫𝐸, 2 cats counting Sushi 𝐻𝐡𝐬. Therefore they are all cat people, which given they have all fallen to villainy proves that dogs are the correct pet of choice for a pro-hero. Uraraka, lies and slander. Next you will be accusing the wild pussycats of being secrets villains, 𝗫𝐸. Lol, what? Also the only heroes on US staff that are not cat people are Hound Dog and Vlad King. Even Nezu likes cats. Things just sort of devolved from there. By the time she went to bed that night, it was as if the class had seemingly decided collectively to ignore the fact that 𝗫𝐸 was actually technically a villain, and a few had asked if Midoriya would be able to chat the next time he was able to get online. After all, it wasn't like they had done anything all that bad outside of cover for their family, and, well, you could hardly blame them for that. As Todoroki had put it, neither of them were their fathers any more than he was 𝗫𝐸. While the class was obviously still hurting from what had happened, it seemed that they were maybe starting to heal. Kyoka just hoped that everything worked out okay in the end. Yoichi hated this, being trapped as only a watcher as events unfolded around them. As one nephew killed another and stumbled further and further down his brother's own path as he was shoved from behind by All Might. As one built an army in the other's name. As the last, his own holder, fell apart at the seams. The ninth had been in rough shape mentally even before they had all been crammed inside of him, and his mental health was only continuing to go down the drain. He was a 31-year-old man who had been shoved into the body of a 14-year-old with all of their memories, and not only was stuck like that but had been robbed of his own body and named by the brother he loved as dearly as his own son in the last timeline. Yet he still called Problem Child with a hint of fondness and the safety of Private. For the first time ever, he finally understood his brother's insane decision to lock himself up in a vault away from the world. He felt a stab of guilt for wanting to repeat his action with his 𝗪𝗪, to bundle him up in blankets and hug him tight to himself, to protect him from more hurt and from possibly hurting himself as the man in a boy's body stewed in his depression. In his loss, a part of him wondered if it would be possible to separate 𝗪𝗪 from Izuku, to allow his nephew to lock away the memories from his first life and give him a real chance to live again. He didn't know. It was probably for the best. If he knew how, he was worried he might have been tempted to actually do it. Still, in the wake of everything, they needed to finally really talk, not only as uncle and nephew or fellow one for all holders, but hero to hero about what had happened. About the fact that the other 𝗪𝗪 might not be able to come back from this like had been his own brother's case. Not now that the line in the sand that he had previously made had been crossed. Sure, his brother was mostly behaving himself, having settled down with his little family, but it was clear from what they were seeing now at the base camp of Nines that he hadn't exactly stopped villainy completely. In fact, from the sounds of things from those around the camp and from how both of Ten's husbands were acting, the man had actually been a villain for a while and had seemingly neglected to mention that fact to Izuku. Still, the revelations Yoichi had had as of the past month and a bit in Izuku's custody had not all been horrible. Ten had done the impossible and saved his father from death. Not a fake death either, as the sickening memory of feeling his brother's skull spilled beneath his fist thanks to All Might that was forever burned into his psyche could attest. And he hadn't just stopped there but been the driving force behind Hisashi really stepping back from villainy like Yoichi had once begged for him to do. Unfortunately, it seemed likely that he had only appeared to have done the latter because his sons were stepping up to fill the gap he was leaving behind. Yoichi was forced to wonder if Ten was even aware that he was slowly being groomed to take his father's place as a new symbol of evil. He wasn't even sure which option would be better. If he wasn't aware, then that meant that maybe there was still hope for him to come back from all of this and become a hero once more, but on the other hand, that meant that his nephew was not being forcible tricked further down the path and was probably not doomed to a life chosen for him that he hated. It wasn't like he could really guess either way when it came to 10, given that as far as he could tell, his nephew couldn't care less about legalities when it came to saving people, with the knowledge that in the man's past life, he basically had gone full vigilante for months before the end. Plus there was also the incident with Stain in that timeline to consider as well. It was probably pretty telling that 𝐬𝐻 had seemed more exasperated about the whole secret villain stuff that his brother had been doing than anything. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 was not sure if he was more annoyed with Problem Child or impressed with him in wake of moving into the base camp. On one hand, somehow his brother had managed to find and recruit all the core members of the League of Villains that his other meddling had not prevented the fall of. But on the other hand, this was all stuff that he really would have preferred to know about before being surprised dropped into the middle of all of them. There were absences in the group from those that had attacked the training camp, of course, but he didn't have to wonder what had happened to at least one of them, with 𝐸's casual display of using pump-up to boost his own strength for manual labor around the camp. Muscular's absence frankly was a given with how Problem Child felt about people going after small children. He did have to wonder about Todoroki Taoya's presence at least, even if the man seemed a bit more mellow than his alternate counterpart and didn't seem to be bothering with the whole secret identity thing. Plus there was the fact that he didn't have a single burn scar on him too. He would have to ask about him when they finally liberated 𝐲𝐻𝐸 from his current imprisonment and why he had not been helped like he had with Shimura Tenko. The same was true of Toga Himeko, but with how radically different she was acting compared to her counterpart, perhaps this was the result of 𝐲𝐻𝐸 helping. She had been the youngest living in the camp before Izuku and Hitoshi had arrived, and she was thriving. It seemed that prior to both their arrival, Himeko had been basically the precious princess of the camp. In fact, with the exception of 𝗳𝗲𝗍, everyone except her were in their 30s at least, so frankly the fact that they had apparently been handed a little girl with an unfortunate quirk requirement of blood in their mid to late 20s and had collectively decided that she was basically all of their kid was actually kind of sweet. Izuku found his train of thought being derailed by a poke to the side of the head. He blinked and turned to look at a sweetly smiling Himeko. "You look like you were stuck in your head again. Itoshi told me to make sure you didn't get too stuck while he and his dads were gone. So do you want to talk about what was making you make such a serious frowny face?" She made a little pout for emphasis. Izuku considered her for a beat before deciding it was best to just humor her by telling her something. "I am worried about how 𝐲𝐻𝐸 is doing. A complete radio silence about what the heroes are actually planning for him has me on edge." That wasn't a complete lie either. Even if his thoughts had been actively on something else when she interrupted him, he had been definitely worrying about that earlier. A part of him hated the fact that now the heroes were the other, but so long as they held on to Problem Child that would be the case. She frowned and plopped down on the swing bench that hung on the porch of the largest cabin there that he had been sitting swinging and thought, "What's he like?" "Your other brother." Izuku shrugged. "He has to be the most disaster-prone person I have ever met, and that isn't exactly a low number of people." She giggled. "And you love him anyways." Izuku smiled. "Yeah, but he is also one of the bravest and kindest people too. I could say without a shadow of a doubt I would, even if we had not actually been family. He is a symbol of hope." She seemed to light up at that. "You know, Taoya calls him that too. Apparently he found Taoya when he was in a bad place mentally and introduced him to 𝐸. The rest was basically history after that, but he was the one that basically restored Taoya's faith in humanity." Izuku leaned back in his seat and swung his legs to help rock them in the swing. "Yeah, he is rather good at that." Hours later, Izuku opened his eyes in the strangest place he had ever been. However, he was at least not confused by it. Problem Child had described the inside of One for All to him before, after all, as well as the people inside it. Still, he jerked back in surprise at the sight of the frazzled-looking man practically in his face. "Oh, thank God that worked. Hey, 𝐸𝐻, I've been trying to reach out to you for a couple days now. We need to talk about 10. Given the man bore the same face as Problem Child with the exception of his green eyes, much like his own had once been and were again now, this was probably his infamous Uncle Yoichi. But first, Izuku gave the man a glare. "I am not fighting my brother for killing Namu and getting caught." The man recoiled slightly and waved his hands in denial. "Oh God, no. The last thing I want is you trying to fight 10 like I did with Hisashi. Even if I wasn't completely certain you would lose that fight, I still wouldn't recommend following my lead on that. While I can't say I approved of both of your brothers going into villainy like my brother, from what I have seen from skimming your memories of the last timeline, I would rather them than what happened last time." Izuku snorted. "Gee, your vote of confidence in my abilities as a pro-hero really cheers me up." First winced at the deadpan. "I'm sorry, but the fact remains he has had his copy of One for All for far longer than you have, as well as your old quirk Erasure and all the other quirks he now has at his disposal. While you likely are physically stronger from the training you did with 8th, you still likely would lose that matchup." Izuku sighed and nodded. Yeah, he had realized that a while ago. He decided to change the topic. "You watched my memories." His copy of his ghostly uncle shrugged. I wanted to confirm just how much that Ten had said about the other timeline was true once I realized you were in the same boat as him. Don't worry, I am the only one who can freely do it since the others are just sort of along for the ride, and like I said, I only skimmed. Much more without your permission seemed like an invasion of privacy. Not that you seem to have any issues with that with the other holders, Izuku was quick to point out. Another wince. To be fair, you are the first case where I have been able to interact with a holder directly before you died. Most of the time, when the holders find out, they are sort of already dead and in the same shoes as me now, so are pretty forgiving given that watching through the eyes of the current holder is sort of the only way we can keep up with current events. Izuku cast his gaze around. Speaking of, where is everyone else? The guilty look on his uncle's face immediately raised a red flag. They're sleeping. Bullshit. I know that look. 𝐲𝐸 makes it when he is trying to break bad news to me and tries to soften the blow by giving me a white lie. Where are the other vestiges? The man winced and rubbed the back of his neck. It isn't a lie. Not really. All of them are currently still dormant. I am the only one that stays fully awake during the transfer process between holders since I am the one who actually does it. Normally I wake them up a couple days later once the quirk settles, but I might just have not done it yet. When I saw 𝐬𝐴𝐵 through your eyes for the first time following the transfer, I might have panicked and decided to wait to wake them up until I figured out what the hell was going on. Izuku gave the man an unimpressed look. It's been nearly 2 months. A grimace. I might be worried about how they are going to react to you when I wake them up. It would be one thing if you were unknowingly hanging around my brother as an innocent kid, but not only do you know perfectly well who he is, you are a grown-ass adult. He gestured pointedly at Izuku at that last point, prompting Izuku to look down at himself for the first time since he opened his eyes inside the quirk. Oh, Yoichi felt a stab of guilt as the look of sorrow and loss flashed over his nephew's face as he looked down at his own adult form, at a body that was a hodgepodge of his two different forms. Psychically, he was largely back to being Aizawa 𝐲𝐸, hero costume and all, but there were bits and pieces of Izuku there too. Little details. Despite having both scars around his left eye that he had held before being sent back to the wrong body, he still had two brilliant green eyes much like his own, and the long white hair that he had dyed black from such a young age had been replaced with green. Freckles now painted his body in a familiar pattern to Izuku but completely foreign on the older man. Freckles that the man was studying on the back of his hand as if they held the secrets of the universe. I'm never going to really be Aizawa 𝐲𝐸 ever again, am I? If even in here I'm not, then there really is no going back, is there? Yoichi sighed and tugged the man into a clearly needed hug. I'm sorry. He just sighed in return and leaned into it. I feel like an idiot. I've known from the moment 𝐲𝐸 walked into the hospital room after I woke up that there was no fixing this. Why was it that I was so stupid to keep pretending I was Aizawa 𝐲𝐸 crammed in my problem child's body with his memories stapled on? I am Midoriya Izuku, just with memories of another life that doesn't even fucking matter anymore. Why was I going about thinking like this as anything but the reincarnation that it is? He gave a broken sob as he reached a hand up between them to scrub at his face. 𝐲𝐸 had been alive here in this timeline for over a decade before I was even conceived. This wasn't me being sent back in time. It was me being reborn in the new timeline that 𝐲𝐸 made. Yoichi was not sure how he was supposed to respond to that. Still, he had to try. Yeah, your brother really lives up to your title of problem child for him, huh? That earned a breathy chuckle. I don't fucking care if he is technically the older one now or that he has been an adult for over a decade. He will always be problem child. He shook his head and pulled back. We have gotten off topic. You wanted to discuss him. Yoichi released the man from his grip. Even if he wanted to cocoon him in all the blankets and hugs that he frankly needed. Yeah, we need to talk about the fact that when you see him again there is a chance he might not be completely himself anymore. His nephew went rigid before snapping full back to attention. What do you mean by that? Yoichi sighed and averted his gaze. My brother didn't just wake up one day and decide to take over the world. I am pretty sure the more he used his quirk, the more addicted to the power that came from it he became. The fact that your brother was hiding his growing criminal empire from you much like 𝐬𝐴𝐵 did with me raised some red flags. Add on to that just how unnecessarily brutal he was with the Namu. Well, if he is as much like 𝐬𝐴𝐵 as he seems to be to me, I am worried that now that he has stolen so many quirks in such a short period of time, that he might have a hard time resisting the urge to use the quirk more like was the case with 𝐬𝐴𝐵. You think he is on the path to repeat what Dad did? Yoichi sighed. I think it is possible that my brother is grooming him to follow him down the same path, but frankly, I don't know enough about Ten to really say if he is allowing this or being tricked into it. Yoichi felt his stomach twist as his nephew paled, making his scars and freckles on his face even more prominent. Fuck, what is it? The man rubbed his face and started to anxiously pace. Sorry, it is just that recontextualized some of what 𝐲𝐸 has said since I woke up. 𝐲𝐸 is willingly allowing it for sure. I thought he was joking around when he mentioned that he had decided to try befriending Yagi so that he would be less likely to repeat what he did with Dad when he found out he was basically the second coming of 𝐴ll-for-one, but he wasn't. He fully intends to take Dad's place to remove him from the board so that there never could be any risk of the future we came from happening again. Yoichi bit his lip. Okay, so what do you plan to do about it? Like I said before, I would highly advise against trying to fight him still. That earned a pained laugh. I guess I am just going to have to help. What the fuck else am I supposed to do? Even if I was physically capable of fighting him, I wouldn't. 𝐲𝐸 was as good as my own kid in the last timeline, even if I had no real claim to him beyond that of his homeroom teacher since we were in the dark about being fucking brothers, and now he has been firmly a part of my whole life, this time as my older brother. I couldn't hurt him if I tried. Yoichi sighed and nodded. Okay, we'll help him. Just don't tell my brother that I am agreeing to this. If he finds out that I am willingly agreeing to help with villainy, he will never let me live it down. That earned a snort from Ninth. Sure, but I doubt you have much to worry about that one, given that 𝐲𝐸 has been covering up the fact that One for All is definitely haunted from him for years at this point. I get the impression that the other you is just about as keen on the idea of talking with him as you probably are. Yoichi frowned. God, it is weird to think that there is a second me out there, even if he only lives inside your brother's head. The man gave him a weak smile. How do you think I felt every time I saw 𝐲𝐸? Welcome to the club. Izuku felt sick as 𝐲𝐸's face was flashed up once more on the TV in the cabin in the woods. There were plenty of cabins in the area, but they currently had all had to cram inside one of the 2-bedroom cabins as it was the only one with a working TV. It wasn't a bad picture of him, but the clear background of Tartarus and his clearly dazed and drugged-out look in his eyes made his stomach churn. He had agreed to travel back in time to save his problem child, but right now, his brother was barely faring better than he had been when they had been sent back, and he had already been dead then. His mother tugged him tight to her side as they listened to the news that they had been dreading. That 𝐲𝐸's trial was going to be held with him calling in remotely from the prison instead of attending in person. 𝐴ll-for-one sighed and rubbed his face. Well, that's it then. We are going to have to raid Tartarus to get him back. So much for 𝗵𝗲 just opening a warp gate for him to escape through. Even if we had the exact coordinates for his cell for him to open a gate up into it, it looks like they are probably keeping 𝐲𝐸 drugged up to the gills on top of restraining him. Izuku sighed as he closed his eyes. How was it that in trying to prevent things from falling apart, they were now the ones breaking everything? The irony of what was happening was not lost on him, especially with the knowledge that members of the League of Villains last time around were literally scattered among them, with Kurogiri standing in the same room as 𝐴ll-for-one, a group that he himself had decided he was actually joining for real when he could in the wake of the conversation he had held with his ghostly uncle the night before. Izuku messaged his forehead. We can't let any of the other villains inside escape when we break him out. Gran Torino just snorted. No shit, but there is no we here, kid. That includes you or the other kids. You are staying put here with 𝐴ll when we do this. Actually, he leapt the distance to stick his head out the door and pointed out at Tauya, who had been leaning on the porch railing with the members of the League who had remained out on the porch to listen through the open door so that things were not even more cramped. You are hanging back to help 𝐴ll babysit and help guard the place while we are all gone. The youngest proper League member grimaced before sighing and nodded. Yeah, that is probably for the best. There is no way that 𝐴ll wouldn't turn up for a raid on Tartarus, and I am not sure I wouldn't be tempted to try and pick a fight with him if he did. He turned to Nine. Strike him with a bolt of lightning for me, would ya? Nine gave him an amused look. Sure thing. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. 𝐬𝐸 wasn't sure if he hated his job or not. It was not like it was a hard job most days, and the money more than compensated for the risk that came from being in an enclosed space with so many dangerous individuals, even if they had all been rendered mostly harmless by the combination of quirk suppressants, sedatives, and, in one special case, quirk-activated machine guns turrets. Frankly, his job watching screens in the security office would have been positively dull if it had not been for the possible danger constantly hovering over his head. So with that in mind, it was little surprise that he noticed the moment something changed in his small little office. It nearly took too long for him to realize what was happening as a black mist that just weeks ago would have been a reassuring sight crawled over the wall beside him, cutting off his only exit. As it crawled over the ground outside, just inside the gates, he slammed his hand down on the special emergency alarm button they had installed for just this event as the former voice hero strolled into the room with a smirk at him before he screamed and everything went silent. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. On the lowest level of the prison, 𝐲𝐸 felt himself smile as a familiar voice rang out that penetrated even down to his little cell. It would seem that the cavalry had finally arrived. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. 𝐴ll-for-one was attacking Tartarus. Toshinori was moving before he had even fully processed the emergency alert blasted over the hero network. Hawks meet him outside the front gates of UA as they had coordinated with the HPSC in wake of the arrest of 10 with the knowledge that this attack was only a matter of time. Before he could even blink, the pair of them were airborne under Hawk's power, speeding directly to the prison island. Hopefully they would get there before it was too late. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Hisashi shoved the whimpering dog mutation man from his seat in front of the monitors as he clutched his bleeding ears, feeling a bit guilty. Still, he had work to do. Aburo appeared behind him and took one look at the man on the floor before sighing and warping him away. He could have lowered the volume a bit given the man's quirk. Hisashi shrugged at his husband. "Hey, I decided it was better to not risk it." He turned back to the computers and began to use some of the hacking skills he had picked up as a necessity from working under Netsu for a few years. It took only seconds to realize an issue as he clicked through camera feeds. Shit, the cameras are labeled by prisoner numbers or letters for common areas like hallways. So much for just finding 𝐲𝐸 on the cameras and warping him out quickly before the heroes get here. Aburo sighed and patted him on the shoulder. It was still worth trying. Still, that is why Plan B was the real plan. Do you need me here or should I shadow the rest of the league? Hisashi tapped his ear. Just keep an ear out for me on the off chance I need evac. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Hawks was internally freaking the fuck out. Sure, you wouldn't be able to tell he was anything other than cool as a cucumber from the outside, but that didn't change the fact he knew that he was probably flying both him and All Might into a suicide mission. The man who had nearly killed All Might just 6 years before, when All Might had still been at full strength, was breaking the son of his out of prison, who had danced circles around All Might and had only gotten captured because Snipe had gotten a lucky shot. They were fucking screwed. Still, there was not much for it at this point. He was a hero, and heroes had to at least try and stop the villains. He was there to get All Might in faster, and then it would be his job to help stall as best as possible until backup arrived, while All Might handled All for One, something only he could do without immediate repercussions. After all, All Might didn't have a quirk to steal anymore. That had been a kick in the teeth for everyone in the hero community when that secret had come out. All Might had given away his quirk, a quirk that had not been his own to begin with. One for All, a quirk created by All for One, had accidentally been returned to the villain's control when All Might had chosen Midoriya Izuku as his successor for the quirk. While, yes, the man was not completely powerless yet, his power was fading rapidly, and he had admitted that he might not even last the full fight, but he could at the very least buy them time to stop the likely oncoming mass breakout. The issue in that lay in the fact that All for One was definitely not alone, and from what they could likely guess, he was flying into a fight with not only unknown villains but former heroes as well. He needed to find and take out the former Loud Cloud, now going by Kurogiri, before he could become a problem. So long as the former hero stood with the villains, he was the biggest threat on the field outside of All for One himself purely from a tactical standpoint. The warp gates he could create would control the field of play in the villain's favor. On the bright side, at least the former present mic now reverb would not be an issue. All heroes responding to the alert had access to sound dampening ear protection that would cancel out the man's quirk completely but not otherwise impair their hearing, as they digitally cut out any sound registering over 100 decibels. And that he was likely the one who would be acting backup for Kurogiri. It should hopefully be possible for Hawks to get in close and take out both former heroes before they could aid too much in the breakout. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Glanced over at his brother-in-law as his misty form melted out of thin air next to his place perched atop the gatehouse between his father and both Kuruka and Chijuro. Plan B then? The Pillar of Mist shrugged. It was always more of a plan anyways. Still, it doesn't hurt to be optimistic. Any sign of the heroes yet? 𝐸 looked back out across the bridge with scan activated. Not yet. His father chuckled and pointed out over the ocean to their collective right. Though, I wouldn't be too sure of that. It seems that All Might was able to hitch a ride. I trust the four of you can handle Hawks. Chijuro snorted. 𝐸 should be more than able to swat him from the sky with a bit of lightning. All for One hummed in thought. Yes, I suppose that would be true. If you would be so kind as to wait until they are over the prison or bridge, please, though. Fierce wings would be such a waste of a quirk to lose to the sea around us. Kurogiri seemed to consider the growing speck in the distance. I could probably catch them once they get a bit closer if you wanted to hit them while they were still over the water. Kuruka gave the man a teasing glare as 𝐸 nodded and raised a hand up to start calling in a storm. No one likes a show-off. Kurogiri chuckled and gestured to All for One to his other side. I believe I hardly stack up as one compared to certain others here. His father feigned mock offense at that before chuckling as well. What is the fun of power if you don't get to show it off from time to time? Besides, I'll have you know that being overdramatic is one of the baseline requirements for being a supervillain. To quote one of my brother's superhero movies, the difference between a villain and a super one is all in the presentation. 𝐸 turned his attention back to the swiftly closing in heroes. Kurogiri, tell me when. A little closer. All for One continued as he stared out over the waters himself. I do admit to feeling a bit bad about this. Sorahiko is going to be rather upset when he finds out that he had no hope of breaking 𝐲𝐸 out fast enough after all. Now, 𝐸 snapped his arm down, lightning answering his call. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. 𝐍𝐴 growled to himself as he had to wait for his little group of villains that he was herding along deeper and deeper into the prison to catch up so that either Mr. Compress or one of Twice's clones could cut a hole big enough for him to pass through the solid steel barrier. This was taking too long. If they couldn't get down to Xiao soon, then it was only a matter of time until Toshi. He shook his head to clear it of his dark thoughts. There was no way around it without Xiao to force his father to stop. God only knows that 𝐍𝐴 begging for Toshinori's life wouldn't work. He had tried it before back when he was still relatively in All-for-One's good graces before he had accepted the divorce as real. The only way the man would have done so at the time would have been if 𝐍𝐴 had agreed to take him back, but he had been far too mad at the man to consider it, and now that the man had remarried, that bargaining chip had long been removed from the table. Finally, Mr. Compress, Twice, and Magni slid around the corner, all panting slightly. Finally, Compress, I need you to make another opening. Compress held up a hand and rested it on the wall. As I was trying to say before you ran ahead, I can compress the three of us so you can carry us so you don't have to keep waiting on us to play catch up. 𝐍𝐴 made a noise of frustration. Why the hell did you not say something sooner? Magni glared at him. He's been trying to for the past 10 minutes. Twice glared too as an opening in the barrier appeared as compressed a circle in the reinforced raised wall and immediately uncompressed it to fall to the floor. Yeah, you kept running off before he could get a word in edgewise. I mean, I would hate hanging out with us two as if I was a former hero, but really, how are we supposed to be your backup if you keep running off? Forget us. We suck. We are just holding you back. I mean, at least take Mr. with you since he is the one that can open all the doors. 𝐍𝐴 held out a hand, palms up. Just do your little magic trick already. We're on the clock. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Toshinori gasped for air as he crashed rolling across the pavement after falling through a warp gate. The horrible smell of burnt flesh, hair, and feathers filled his nose as he realized what had just happened as he took in the sight of the young hero that had previously held him in his arms over the water just seconds before lay limp on the ground next to him. As blank eyes stared at him from behind tinted water-spotted lens, Toshinori recoiled in shock from the body of the young hero who had just moments before been worried, looking up at the storm, commenting that they should turn back and come in for another approach and not risk the artificially swiftly growing storm. The boy that he had encouraged to keep going, more worried about trying to stop All-for-One than about any risks to their own safety. There was the crunch of shoes on gravel just out of his line of vision, locked on the so very young hero's cooling corpse. What a shame. He could have survived had you not made yourselves such easy targets. Not with his quirk, of course, but that is just a given. A pair of nice black leather shoes strolled into his line of vision. Still, I suppose I could still possibly save him if you are patient enough to let me. It would just be a matter of restarting his heart before too much time has elapsed and hoping for the best, but, well, there is no guarantee it would work. Toshinori looked up at the monster masquerading as human standing over him. Why would you save him? What would you want? All-for-One flashed his horrible smile that Toshinori had to resist, immediately trying to punch off of him. His quirk, of course, but like I said previous, that is a given. For you, however, he leaned down so their faces were closer together. I want you to pass on a message to the other heroes for me. Toshinori's head spun. Just a message. Well, I can hardly delude myself into thinking you would just give up your own life without at least a bit of a fight, but for young 𝐴𝐻𝐸 here, a message would suffice, since I doubt he will be coherent enough for it himself if I can successfully bring him around. If not, well, 𝐲𝗏 is rather good at bringing people back from the dead, if I do say so myself. Toshinori looked down at the young man, at 𝐴𝐻𝐸, a man whose name he hadn't even known, but All-for-One had. Just when had he become just so cut off from his other heroes? Years ago, he would have been able to rattle off the names and who as a person every one of the top 10 with him was and called them his friends, but now half of the leaderboard he hadn't even spoken with one-to-one before the reveal of Eraserhead being 10 and the underground heroics system completely falling apart. The kid didn't deserve this. The young hero, while good at what he did, was still far too young to have ranked so high, and Toshinori wasn't so blind as to not see that he was a mouthpiece of the HPSC in the wake of everything. The kid deserved a real life. He deserved to live. Do it? The man's twisted grin widened. Oh, what's the magic word? Please save him if you could. All-for-One. The man practically preened as he leaned back before stepping over to rest his palm on the cheek of young 𝐴𝐻𝐸. There was a too long pause filled only with the rain and a crack of lightning before the young hero shot up to a seated position, leaving the remains of his wings behind as they lazily drifted up into the air to resettle on All-for-One's back. All-for-One stepped back and looked up at the collection of figures above them that up until then had gone unnoticed for Toshinori. Tirajiri, I believe the former hero Hawks could use a doctor. Well, what is? Toshinori watched as black mist swallowed the confused and hurt but alive young hero. He let out the breath he had been holding. Thank you. A chuckle far closer than he had been expecting. Oh, I wouldn't thank me yet. After all, you still have a message to deliver. Toshinori spun his head around to look into a part of Scarlet Eye's mere centimeters from his own. What is the message? Toshinori swallowed back the fear that bubbled up from the close proximity to the monster that had killed his mentor, who had nearly killed him, who had helped raise the boy he had been growing fond of as if he was his own son. A traitorous part of his mind whispered. The man's grin turned even more wicked than before as his hands lashed out to grab him around either side of the head. This, 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. The crack of the breaking neck echoed up to them even through the growing noise of the storm, making 𝐴varo flinch. Had he known that this was probably going to happen? Yes, that still did little to dull the shock of the man that had held the title of #1 hero his whole life falling dead at his father-in-law's feet. All for one stood back up to his full height, his silhouette now framed with a set of tattered red and black wings. 𝐴varo couldn't help but think the image made him look somehow even more like his self-given title of a demon lord than ever before. The man shoved a hand in one of his pockets to pull out a handkerchief and began to wipe his hands with it. Kurogiri, if you would be so kind as to deliver the message to the approaching heroes. I expect it is only a matter of minutes before the first of the reinforcements arrive at the start of the bridge. It would only be fair that they know just what they are signing up for, trying to stop us after all. 𝐴varo sighed and turned to 𝐁 and 𝐀𝐦. Would one of you mind coming with me to help with the body? 𝐀𝐦 shrugged and hopped down to walk over and scoop up the now shrunken form of All Might, the man having reverted to his natural state when he had died like a popped balloon. It's fucking weird that he is so small looking like this. 𝐴varo glided down next to him to warp the two of them to the other end of the bridge and felt a strange twisted pride as the guards that had been sitting in the guardhouse at the other end of the bridge recoiled slightly in clear fear of their sudden appearance. Of himself. Before they could recover though, he threw up a warp gate as a barrier between them and the guns the guards held, not bothering to be fancy about it as he reached out with another warp to collect the rope that they had left behind at the camp. The man hadn't been eating properly in years. Believe it or not, he is actually in better condition than he was a year ago. Well, was better I suppose. 𝐀𝐦 snickered and shifted the body over his shoulder to fish out a new cigar. Yeah, that is going to be weird to get used to. I think the only ones in our group who remember a time before he was #1 are All for One himself and that Gran Torino guy. 𝐴varo huffed and created a cloud under the man's feet before stepping on it himself. Torino was actually one of All Might's teachers and was his foster guardian for about a year from what I've been told. 𝐀𝐦 unbalanced slightly as they began to rise up, forcing him to reach out to grab 𝐴varo's shoulder. Shit, some warning would have been nice. 𝐴varo rolled his eyes, happy that 𝐁 and the other league members had yet to master his expressions over the past month. I would have caught you if you fell. 𝐀𝐦 half him a half-hearted glare. I hate the fact that I can never tell when you are messing with me on purpose or not. He shook his head and strengthened up to shift All Might's body to the top of the gate. So the guy was one of Gran's students. Is that why he has been so weird about everyone talking about killing All Might? Why the fuck is he on our side then? 𝐴varo began the process of wrapping the limbs of All Might to fasten him to the top. Because All Might lived in a world where everything was black and white and never understood how he could have loved All for One once when the man was responsible for the death of the woman that had basically been All Might's mother and was Torino's best friend. Never mind the fact that Torino and All for One divorced long before that even happened. The fact that he is the other biological donor for 10 probably didn't help his case, regardless how non-consensual all of the cloning had been even for All for One. I suspect the only reason he didn't try arresting him for collaboration before everything went to shit at the USJ was the fact that any hero getting arrested would make the news regardless of the fact the man was underground. If that had happened, it would have been only a matter of time before the story of both All for One and 10 started floating around, and I imagine they were trying to curb the panic that would cause. 𝐀𝐦 released his hold on the body and blew out a puff of smoke. Fat lot of good that did him. So Torino is only on our side because the heroes forced him over. No, he is here for 10 too. While he has never really acted to try and be a parent for him since it was never really needed, he still loves 10 as his own kid. Honestly, I think he probably still would have even if they had not been related, given that they are only barely so. I mean, he only slightly favors 10 over me and Reverb too. We were sort of his favorite students besides All Might. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. As the voice of the former hero abruptly cut out, 𝐴𝐻𝐻 Shuhashi carefully peeked back out of his hiding place. Beside him, the man he only knew as Sato, who had been rotated out to guarding the front gate after suffering a recent twisted ankle after an altercation with the prison-wide now infamous 10 on the day the man had been brought, and looked at him for guidance. Please tell me I was hearing that wrong. They haven't, that body wasn't. Shuhashi just gave a sad sigh as he sank back down to the floor of their little guard booth. We're fucked. After all, even if that body was not that of All Might, it was still dressed in the man's hero costume. 𝐲𝐻𝐻 grinned as the familiar small form of his heroic father appeared on the other side of the glass. 10, why the hell are you just sitting there? 𝐲𝐻𝐻 gestured with his head to the corners above the glass pane. I don't exactly enjoy getting shot repeatedly. Do you think you could deal with those so I can get out of here already? Mr. Compress, who had followed Gran Torino through the door, tilted his head slightly as if puzzled. We were under the impression that they were drugging you from the picture they have been using since they first announced your trail publicly yesterday. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 shrugged. They were until they realized it wasn't really doing much with how fast I burned through the stuff. I think they figured that the guns were enough since I was staying put after I accidentally set them off a couple times trying to tap into one for all, even just to talk with the vestiges. His father frowned but pointed up at one of the corners to Compress. Can you get those through the glass? Consider it done. The moment both weapons were destroyed, 𝐲𝐻𝐬 was on his feet, ripping free of the straitjacket restraining him with a burst of power from One for All. It only took the tiniest effort to call for overhaul and pull all the bullets that he had been forced to deal with healing inside of him to drop to the floor. His father looked positively green at the sight. Fuck kid, what the hell? Most of the Namu had passively active healing quirks. I have been healing every time I got shot before they could even consider removing the bullets, not that I figured that they were going to. I might have allowed myself to get shot a few times while figuring out how the turrets exactly worked. That's why I decided to just wait for you guys in the end. While I could definitely have left on my own, I figured it wouldn't hurt to just wait a bit so I didn't get shot as much on the way out. If you guys hadn't shown up soon though, I might have just broken out anyways. Well, hopefully his father's largely dumbstruck expression was a good thing. Mr. Compress, while harder to read thanks to his mask, 𝐲𝐻𝐬 suspected from his readjustment and posture that he was staring at 𝐲𝐻𝐬 in open awe. Oh, right, that was a thing with him in this timeline, wasn't it? He had nearly forgotten how the thief had reacted to him after 𝐲𝐻𝐬 had found him as a civilian and point-blank recruited him to keep an eye on his brother 9 and his friends years before. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 held out a hand to the bulletproof glass partition and shattered it the rest of the way with another burst of overhaul. Well, what are you waiting for? Lead the way. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Todoroki Enji slammed on his brakes in front of the last gate to the bridge between him and Tartarus and found himself scrambling out of his car in shock. Best Jeanist, who had been in the car following behind him, had to swerve to avoid hit him or the car, but that hardly registered as he looked at the broken form of the former number 1 hero. This was not supposed to be how he became number 1. He felt a bit sick as he felt his own flames be extinguished in the downpour. But this was not the time to panic. He had a job to do. He swallowed back the bile at the back of his throat. Someone call it in, and Jeanist get him down from there. Vernon popped her head out of the car. Already done. The commission got a report of Hawks being dumped badly inquired and quirkless in the middle of a hospital waiting room a couple minutes ago. They are waiting to get something coherent out of him about what happened, but one of the doctors noted that his burns look electrical. Best Jeanist, who now held the body gingerly in his own arms, cast his face skyward despite the rain. One of All for One's other sons had a weather manipulation quirk, correct? It seems likely that he is here as well to help with the retrieval of his brother. Likely. He turned back to Vernon. No, it was 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐵. Stay here with All Might and keep the glory seekers out. He paused. And if I don't come back, look after my family as best you can. All right. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 gained a serious look that normally would have seemed out of place on her face and gave a small nod before giving a shaky smile. You better not make me have to, Enji. You come back here and look after them yourself. He gave a sad smile before turning to give Best Jeanist a firm nod before leading the way. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. 9 hummed to himself from his perch on the entrance gate of the island and raised his arm to gather another lightning strike. He had a promise to keep with his adopted son after all. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Class 1 official 𝗫𝐿. You guys watching the news. Eshido, please tell me that this isn't you guys 𝗫𝐿. Not me and Izuku personally, but yeah, that is the league heading Tartarus. My money is on All Might probably being dead already. If Hawks had already turned up quirkless Todoroki, then it is likely that they will be gone before my father arrives. Shame, I was hoping that he would lose his quirk in all this. Itoshi paused as he had to reread that. He looked up from his phone at Tauya, who was munching on popcorn watching the TV with Himiko and Izuku while his grandmother stress-baked in the kitchen to not worry about the rest of the family not present. Todoroki Tauya. The guy who had asked that Endeavor specifically get hit by lightning before the raid was over. The guy who did look a lot like Todoroki Shoto now that he thought about it. He sent Todoroki a private message. 𝗫𝐿. Slightly off-topic question. Todoroki, do you have an older brother who also hates your father for some reason? Todoroki. Oh, is Natsuo a member of your group? Good for him. 𝗫𝐿. No, I mean a guy named Tauya. Todoroki. Oh, how he's actually alive then. Fayumi and Natsuo will be thrilled. 𝗫𝐿. He is the only real member of the league not on the raid. I think my Uncle 9 might have adopted him at some point, but I am not entirely sure on that. The reason I asked was because he asked 9 to hit your father with lightning during the raid, so he at least should stick around until Endeavor shows up. Todoroki. Sweet, thank him for me later if either your father or grandfather steal Hellflame before they come back. 𝗫𝐿. Will do. Are you good dude? Like safe at home? Todoroki. I will be soon. Hitoshi felt slightly sick at the implications he was getting from this conversation. He found himself thinking of the boy's scarred face and awkward demeanor around others with a good bit of guilt. Of all people, he should have seen the red flags the other boy had been giving off. He found himself looking up at 𝐽𝐬 as he laughed as the news dropped the reveal that All Might had been killed in the raid before the other heroes could arrive as backup, and couldn't help but wonder how much his dad knew about the situation. After all, there was no way he couldn't know given he was the one that had apparently found 𝐽𝐬 like he had found Hitoshi himself. Suddenly his dad slipping Todoroki a piece of paper during homeroom on that Monday a month before made a bit more sense. He had probably been offering him a way out like he had with 𝐽𝐬. Hitoshi had to wonder if his dad had helped the man with such a self-destructive quirk fake his death in the first place. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸 was surprised by the lack of heroes as he stepped out into the rain for the first time in well over a month with a wild grin. He childishly turned his face up to the sky and spun in the downpour as a flash of lightning crashed down on the bridge outside. His father blew past him to jump up to the top of the gate beside the figures looking out over the bridge, but he hardly cared. He was outside. 𝐽𝐬 doubted he would ever hate the rain again after going so long without it. He laughed as he drank in the smell of the surrounding sea and the hint of ozone from the lightning at his only elder brother's beck and call. He was still enjoying his freedom when a large warm body slammed into him and began to stroke the top of his head. He felt the tentative prodding of his dad's quirk against his own. "My, quite the haul you got there. Feeling up for a few more? I believe the one I just picked up would see better use in your hands." 𝐽𝐬 felt his quirk practically purr as his dad passed over the new quirk, one that he knew immediately before it could even settle on his own back. "You killed 𝐸𝐡𝐻." He looked up with a gaze of disapproval. His dad grinned and backed off with his hand up in surrender. "Technically your brother did. Don't worry, I restarted his heart for the doctors before Kurogiri warped him away." 𝐽𝐬 winced at the name. Yes, he knew that his husband was now using it for his own villain name by choice this time, but the Kurogiri issue from the last timeline had become a bit of a sore spot. "Still, thank you for restraining yourselves." His dad hummed with a smile and a pat on the shoulder as a cry of anguish drifted over to them from his other father. The smile dropped. That's unfortunate. I had hoped that they would wait to inform him until after we were gone." 𝐽𝐬's stomach dropped. There was only one thing that would have elicited that sort of response from his normally stoic father. "All Might is dead then." The dad just hummed and resumed cuddling and petting him. It was frankly pathetically easy to snap his neck. He bargained for Takami's life, not realizing I was planning on bringing the other man back anyways so I could get his quirk. I believe the shock from your brother likely stunned him a bit when it stopped Takami's heart too. Even with 𝐽𝐬 having filed the man firmly as his enemy, the part of him that had been the quirkless Deku who the man had saved so long ago in another life, broke at the news. At his dad's callousness about it, his fingers tightened on his dad's suit jacket. "Where? I had your husband deliver him to the heroes to remove the temptation for you, 𝐽𝐬. I know the part of you that was the ninth still sees him as a friend even after all of this. I'm sorry, but it was for your own good." 𝐽𝐬 gave a sob as he nodded. He hated that his father was right. That man might have been All Might, but he wasn't his All Might. That one had been nothing but his enemy from the start. Hell, the man had terrified him to the point of giving him nightmares from time to time. He was better off with his father having killed the man. At least this way he had not been forced to do it himself. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸 had failed. He had saved one son, yes, but at the cost of the life of another. He had made a mistake in thinking that he could get in and out fast enough that the fight wouldn't happen. He should have stayed up top and left the saving to the villains. As Toshi was dead and now he was unlikely to even get a chance to see his son's burial. A chance to ensure that he was buried beside Nana. He hoped to God that either Nezu or Sasaki would ensure it. Knowing the commission, they would likely try and ignore the man's will and bury him in a massive tomb as a martyr. He couldn't even be mad at all for one for doing it. He had kept his promise after all. Toshi probably didn't even feel a thing. Nezu found himself really wishing he could get drunk right now. That he could just turn off his brain for a bit as society began to break down and panic as the news of the raid and All Might's swift death at the raiders' hands circulated. This was not an ideal outcome, but the fight was not technically over yet as more heroes appeared on the scene and one brave news crew took a helicopter out into the quirk-controlled storm, clearly riding on the hope that the villains would rather their fight be broadcast to the masses than want to swat them from the sky. Still, getting drunk was not an option so long as he was playing nice with the commission. Not if he wanted to keep from being caged himself. After all, he was not supporting the heroes in this fight but the villains. One woman, the one that had accompanied himself to visit with Ten during the one time he had been allowed, cast a nervous look around the group. 𝐸𝐸 has just been dumped dead outside the hospital. 𝐸𝐡𝐻 was left at alongside an injured and a quirkless best jeanist. Ten was the one who took his quirk apparently while flying out on 𝐸𝐻's wings. Madam President frowned. Any good news at least? Villains that look injured at all. The other woman shook her head. None of the heroes have even been able to get close enough to them to hurt them. A man that 𝐀𝐦 recognized as 𝐬𝐡𝐚 𝐍𝐴 from working running the provisional licensing exams every year lowered the phone from his ear. A man that he vaguely remembered that 𝐷 had mentioned liking, which was a rare title for a commission member to hold. Well, it sounds like 𝐷 Torino wasn't happy that 𝐷𝐼 died while he wasn't watching at least. Maybe we'll get some infighting in the group. 𝐀𝐦 frowned lightly. I find that unlikely. 𝐷 Torino knows better than anyone that picking a fight with 𝐴𝐿 is a losing battle, and I doubt he would fight 𝐷 when he has gone to such lengths to hide him from possibly being caught. On the other hand, I believe we should focus on the positive that thus far only 𝐴𝐿 and 𝗏𝐻𝐵r have been killed. All guards that are accounted for are still alive and relatively intact. Additionally, given that 𝐷 Torino likely was the one that led the raid inside the base while 𝐴𝐿 stood guard outside, it is possible that the guards still missing are unharmed as well. He tilted his head. Is 𝐷 still the only known former inmate that has been spotted? So far, yeah. Then that would likely be another bright side. It is possible that they are only collecting 𝐷 and will leave when the heroes stop being of interest to them without a mass breakout like we feared. Whether this is because they aren't interested in reeling them in or if they have killed all of them and stolen their quirks, we will have to wait and see. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 gained a thoughtful look before a look of panic flashed over his face. We need to get the heroes out of there now. They aren't bothering with the prisoners because there are even better quirks being handed to them outside. As the president immediately shot the man down, 𝐀𝐦 smirked slightly into his cup of tea. Well, at least one member of the group had a brain. He would have to talk to 𝐷 about the man later. A mind like that would be a waste to lose after all when he could be encouraged to work elsewhere where he would actually be listened to. Or maybe better yet, 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Mayor's stomach sank as his worry about the UA principal was basically confirmed when the Chimera did nothing to help support his point but seemed to sit back to watch the show in front of him. Or raise the point in the first place. He knew from working with the quirked animal that he did not like having to deal with the commission, but he had always assumed that they were of the same mind that it was a necessary evil. Clearly, however, that was not the case. As he felt the animal's eyes on him, he was suddenly very glad he had not raised his own concerns about 𝐁𝐦 in the wake of the reveal of 𝐷. The villain had been working comfortably on his own staff for years, and he was not stupid enough to think for one second that the man's status as a villain was ever a secret from him. But he ended up biting his tongue out of concern what would happen if he drew too much attention to that fact when the vast majority of active high-ranking heroes had come from UA either with him as the principal or even as a teacher. It was bad enough that so many young heroes were under suspicion from just the tenuous connection they had with Midoriya 𝐲𝐻𝐸 as their teacher, but even 𝐴𝐿 had learned under 𝐁𝐽. If 𝐁𝐽 went down, the whole public faith in the hero system in Japan would too. And the rat knew it. Mira excused himself, unable to take this anymore, and just walked out of the meeting room and climbed the stairs up to the roof to clear his head. It took less than 3 minutes before 𝐁𝐽 joined him. You are wasted on them, you know. It hardly took much of a hint for you to see the real big picture and not what they wanted the heroes and commission to see. Mira nervously bit his lip. What did 𝐷 promise you for your silence? 𝐁𝐽 seemed amused at the question. To tame 𝐿 and a hand in friendship. That was surprising. What? That's it. 𝐁𝐽 hummed. There was also the promise to prevent the apocalypse that he was sent back into the past from, but that one hardly matters at this point given that all but one of the threats had been removed from the board of play before we had even had the pleasure of meeting with him as my student. Say what you will about his methodology. The man is incredibly efficient at what he does. Apocalypse. What? Something worse than what is happening right now. 𝐁𝐽 nodded, which made his stomach sink. From what I understand, at the point he was sent back in time a little over a year from now in the last timeline, several major cities were leveled by his father and the man's followers. Japan was on the brink of collapse when the heroes of that timeline made a last-ditch effort to stop things before they spread to the rest of the world. 𝐿 had suffered a major brain injury, one that he suffered here as well that 𝐷 reversed. That left him with no memories of any of his current family. With no reason to hold back, he destroyed everything around him with little care for the consequences. From what we understand, he was able to recover memories of his sons too late to save 𝐷's life in that timeline, so was forced to use a quirk to send his consciousness back to basically the start, and the rest is history. Mira sucked in a breath with a hiss. Fuck. 𝐁𝐽 gave him an amused look. Indeed. So the reason you covered for 𝐷 was to keep 𝐿 from murdering all of Japan and then the world. In part, yes. There was also the issue that, well, I perhaps accidentally allowed myself to become a bit attached. Mira blinked. So when you say he offered you friendship for you to ignore his less than legal dealings. 𝐁𝐽 flicked his tail. That was actually something that came later. I don't believe he planned on it any more than I did, but humans who can actually see me for what I am are rare, and his own past left him in a position to understand myself in ways that are clearly better than my own understanding. The quirked animal looked down at his paws. While I might like to act like I do, I genuinely have trouble understanding and processing certain emotions like a normal individual. For the longest time, I had assumed it was just a side effect of what I was, but Ten bluntly identified it as a trauma response because he recognized it as being the same as his own. So, yes, we are friends. Mira winced. Sure, it was a pretty open secret that 𝐀𝐦 at some point had gone through some shit that left him fairly distrustful of most humans, but it was another thing to hear him talk about it as if it was just a fact of life. And then there was what was implied about Ten between the lines. Ten was experimented on. 𝐀𝐦 shrugged. I suspect as much but do not know for sure. What I do know about his past is limited to only what I know from this timeline, but he lived a whole additional 31 years in the other and only has ever really spoken in detail about this upcoming year's alternate path. Something to keep in mind is the fact that the man was created, not born. Even in this timeline, much of his early years are sketchy at best prior to him meeting the former hero present Mike in this timeline, and I only got that far back because 𝗵𝗃 offered the information, not Ten. Outside of one sighting by 𝐷 and his hero mentor at the time when he was a homeless kid, his records basically don't exist before that point. 𝐀𝐦 shook his head. While he claims that the doctor who created him mistakenly abandoned him as a failure, I am uncertain of the truth to that, especially in the wake of the discovery of his son Shinzo Hitoshi, who was cloned directly from him. I think a mix-up is far more likely, and he was still living under the man's control unknowingly, possibly on both their parts. Regardless of the truth though, legally speaking, he did not exist before 𝐷 stumbled across him, and, well, it is not hard to imagine the sorts of things that they would do to a kid that was considered worthless at the time. Mira released the breath he had accidentally started holding midway through the explanation in pure shock. And why tell me all this? 𝐀𝐦 gave him something he had long since learned was his take on an amused look. Well, how better to recruit you to our cause? Mira blinked. Come again. Ten has no intention of destroying society as we know it. He, like myself, merely thinks it could use a bit of restructuring. To be frank, I believe you likely would be our favored candidate to take over the commission following the restructuring. Mira suddenly wished he had brought his coffee up with him. Why do I suddenly have the feeling that today is going to be a long day for me? 𝐀𝐦, the menace, just smiled. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 was internally screaming. He had decided that they should wait until 𝐲𝗏 was somewhere safe again before reaching out so they didn't distract him, and because of that fact he now had 4 new pro-heroes to babysit until he found out if they were stuck with them permanently or not. 4 very freaked out new vestiges that were trying pretty hard and failing to kill them. Well, all of them except 𝐻𝐸 with his teenage baby face, who was laughing his ass off about all of this. Still actively being stabbed by hawks, he plastered on what could only be considered a customer service smile. As you probably should have figured out by now, you can't kill me. As should be obvious to those of you who shout a grab later on in the fight. This isn't a real place. You are just the quirks of your previous holders. Vestiges. Now if you want to have any chance of getting back to them, calm the fuck down. And why the fuck are we supposed to listen to you? If that is true, then you stole us. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 pinched the bridge of his nose at Mirko's outburst. This is going to be a thing, isn't it? He looked back up at the small crowd that had at least stopped trying to kill one another. No, I am not 10. I am one for all. All for one's late brother and the one who controls what happens with the quirks that 𝐲𝗏 grabs with his copy of All for One, since they all end up in here in my quirk. That earned a few frowns from the heroes. Hawks cocked his head to the side slightly in clear confusion. Wait, Midoriya Izuku gave up One for All to 10. Deku shook his head. No, there are 2 versions of the quirk right now. The one that Yagi gave to Izuku is still with Izuku. It's just time travel bullshit that we ended up stuck with 𝐲𝗏 since he was the man's chosen successor in the other timeline. Best Jeanist gave them all thoughtful looks. So you are just some of the other quirks that he has stolen then? Except for One for All here, I mean. Deku shook his head and thumbed over at 𝐻𝐸 sitting comfortably in his chair behind the former underground hero. Nah, just overhaul over there. The other 3 of us are the quirks from previous holders of One for All like Yagi. I'm Lariat's Black Whip. That is N's smokescreen, and then there is the Forest Hermit's Danger Sense. 𝐻𝐸 huffed and rolled his eyes. Just because I was the one holder that never went into heroics, I still have to point out I was the one that lived to see 40 between all of us. Endeavor looked taken aback. 40. All Might is older than me and I am older than that. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 snorted. Yeah, he's a good decade older than you. Or was at least. Regardless, he is a statistical outlier since he was the only holder that was quirkless. Over time, my quirk slowly overpowers the original quirk of the holder, which is what ended up killing 𝐻𝐸. Human bodies, generally speaking, are just not designed to play host to more than one quirk. There is a reason my brother has only been giving quirks to 9, despite the fact that other members of the League of Villains would probably like some. Best case scenario is the quirks combine into one fancy new one, like what happened with Kurogiri's Cloud becoming 𝗵𝗃𝗏 after the doctor tampered with him after his accident, but that is extremely rare and takes a lot of luck to happen, even trying for it by picking compatible quirks. Most of the time it ends with the holder dying prematurely. Best Jeanist looked at the collection of previous holders of One for All. My apologies, but shouldn't there be more of you then? All Might mentioned that he was the 8th holder, and as you just said, he was an outlier in being quirkless. Mirko nodded and glared at them. Yeah, I am pretty sure he mentioned that he got the quirk from Starlight, and I can't help but notice that I am the only woman here. 𝐀𝐦 winced at the less than subtle accusation. However, before he could say anything, 𝐻𝐸 cut in. I mean, none of them had to stick around with their quirks after their original died. When it became clear how all of this was going to play out now that both versions of One for All are in the hands of Sons of All for One, they decided to move on. The real question you should be asking is why the others besides the boss stuck around. 𝐀𝐦 was relieved that the heroes at least seemed to accept that even if they didn't seem happy about it. 𝗓𝗏 turned to 𝐜𝐡𝐬, who was the ex-holder closest to him. So why did you stay then? 𝐜𝐡𝐬 shrugged. It is in my nature to avoid possible dangerous unknowns. In here, the most dangerous thing happens to be my friend, so there is little reason to worry on my part. I believe 𝐻𝐸 here does not wish to be returned to his original holder for similar reason. That through the heroes, especially Hawks. Wait, you like that 𝗀𝗱? 𝐻𝐸 blushed slightly and shrugged. I have extreme mysophobia and am now somewhere where there is no chance of me ever getting sick. Of course I prefer it here. Besides, from what I have heard, my alternate seems to be quite happy living as a quirkless individual with humor eyes, so I would hardly be surprised if he rejected any offer to return me anyways. He looked off over the edge into what they had started to refer to as the quirksy. I have never really liked quirks myself and what they have done to society. Honestly, if I hadn't been afraid of my quirk being turned around and used on me immediately after its removal, I likely would have given mine up willingly. Deku nodded. Yeah, there is sort of a reason that 𝐴𝐻𝐸 stole Overhaul, and it wasn't just because it is one of his favorites to use now. He did feel extremely guilty when he realized he got his math wrong and took it too early though. He was trying to at least wait until 𝐻𝐸 was an adult, in part at least because, as you can see, he hasn't exactly been able to age in here since. That earned 𝐻𝐸 a curious look from Hawks. Wait, just how old are you really? 𝐻𝐸 blandly gave him a level look. Older than you. I have been 16 for 11 years now. Also, if you think that is bad, at least I haven't been stuck as a teenager for longer than the oldest of you has been alive yet. And half-heartedly glared at 𝐻𝐸. Rude, 𝐻𝐸 snorted. Still true. It seemed that casual statement of fact seemed to throw most of the heroes into a bit of an existential crisis, as it seemed to suddenly hit them just how old some of the vestiges in the quirk with them were despite clearly not looking. 𝗓𝗏 seemed to consider 𝐀𝐻𝐸 himself in a new light. So All Might was not exaggerating when he said that your quirk and brother date back to the quirk wars. 𝐀𝐻𝐸 snorted. Well, the fact that my ex-husband started the last one trying to fight my brother after I died, yeah, that is sort of a given. So you are more than a century old. 𝐀𝐻𝐸 actually brightened slightly as a thought struck him. Yeah, actually with the time travel nonsense, I just realized I am actually the older brother now. Deku gave a bark of laughter. Really, 𝐀𝐻𝐸? You just realized that now? Aren't you the one who was moping about being old because 𝐴𝐻𝐸 has a teenage kid a couple months ago? 𝐀𝐻𝐸 feigned a look of hurt. Deku, you are ruining my cool, wise, ageless being persona. Deku gave him a shit-eating grin. Wise? And how were you planning on pulling that act off? Quoting old movies that no one alive that isn't connected to your brother has seen in decades. As 𝐀𝐻𝐸 leapt at him to tackle him to the ground to tickle him mercilessly. 𝐀𝐻𝐸 was just glad that at least one of the others was still acting as if nothing had changed at all between them. As much as it hurt that both 𝐴𝐻𝐸 and 𝐜𝐡𝐬 were deferring to him like 𝐻𝐸 had always done, and 𝐻𝐸 had turned up that deference to 11, he at the very least understood. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Hawks couldn't help but catch the small panicked looks that flashed over both ends and 𝐜𝐡𝐬's faces as One for All leapt at Lariat, only to quickly relax as the man started tickling the shirtless former hero. A quick look around at the other pros showed that Best Jeanist had clocked at detail too. Something was fishy with that. If it was true and there was no danger of anyone dying, why would they flinch at the sight of a possible fight? And why were they be more focused on him than any of the new pro heroes around them? As you probably should have figured out by now, you can't kill me. The most dangerous thing happens to be my friend. Can't kill me. Hawks froze as his focus locked on immediately to the clear threat. The reason Overhaul hadn't reacted is because he was helping One for All cover up the truth. They all were. The reason the other vestiges were missing was because One for All had killed them. Hawks felt his feathers puffing up in his panic that he was failing to suppress. They were trapped at the mercy of the brother of the most dangerous supervillain in history and had no hope of self-defense if he decided to get rid of them. They couldn't kill him, but he could kill them. A warm hand fell on his shoulder. Hawks, what's wrong? 𝗓𝗏. Still, Hawks did not look away from the threat, who was now looking directly at him from where he was sitting straddling the lap of Lariat, who was recovering his breath on the ground. A look of warning crossed his face, making Hawks take a couple nervous steps back. What's going on? The new unexpected voice startled Hawks airborne and sent him to quickly flee up out of the hole in the dome. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. 𝐴𝐻𝐸 blinked in surprise as Hawks fled at the sound of his voice. From some of the expressions on the faces of the others, clearly he was not the only one. However, before he could ponder that oddity, he was tackled to the ground by the familiar form of his uncle 𝐻𝐻𝐬 as the man wrapped him up in his arms and began violently apologizing. 𝐲𝐻𝐬, while happy for the hug, was extremely confused by the apology. If anything, he should be the one apologizing. Before he could really get a word in edgewise with his uncle, Mirko was in his face. "Hey, are you going to give us back or not? I don't want to hang around here any longer than I have to. You're cutting into my hero-ing." 𝐲𝐻𝐬 blinked in surprise. "Why are you of all of them complaining? Your quirk is basically completely unrelated to your hero persona, and honestly is pretty useless, all things considered." That got him a confused look. "What are you talking about? My quirk is sort of my whole deal." She gestured to all of her, most notably her lagomorphic traits. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 blinked again before the realization hit him and he started to laugh. "Your quirk is just a small light trail quirk. You use it sometimes when you do your special moves, but all it does is make them look a little flashier. All the rabbit stuff is just a full body mutation. For all intents and purposes, you're a quirkless hero. True mutation quirks, as in mutations linked to a person's quirk factor, are rare. I can count on one hand the number of true mutation quirks I have come across. Most should be classified as one of the other classes or as just quirkless." Mirko looked slightly dumbstruck, but that was fair. He had just likely appended her entire understanding of who she was as a hero in person. A hand came down to rest on the top of his head as Deku came over to ruffle his hair. "All right, enough breaking the hero's worldviews. You still need to answer her question. Are we keeping them around long-term or are you giving them back?" 𝐲𝐻𝐬 shrugged. "That is up to what their original holders decided to do. Or well, all except 𝗵𝗲𝗏 here. I can't exactly give a quirk back to a corpse." 𝗵𝗲𝗏 went sheet white. "I'm ... dead." 𝐲𝐻𝐬 winced. "I am not sure how intentional that was on my brother's part, but given how attached he is to your son and his complete loathing of you, I am not terribly surprised. I only got your quirk because while you were technically already dead, you hadn't been dead long enough to prevent me taking the quirk." He turned to 𝐵𝑆T. "You didn't tell him." 𝐵𝑆T looked away from 𝗵𝗏𝗏 with a guilty look. "I wasn't completely sure. I had hoped that the fact you took his quirk meant that he had survived the lightning strike and he had just been stunned." 𝗵𝗏𝗏 basically collapsed in shock. "So that's it then? For you?" "Yes, I plan on trying to give the others back, but I am going to wait a few days for things to cool off before breaking into both Hawks and 𝐵𝑆T hospital rooms. I am less sure about Mirko, if only because I am not even sure she noticed that I stole her quirk now." That made the woman in question burst out in a fit of laughter. "Oh, fuck, you really aren't going to be able to give me back, are you? I'll just think you are trying to force another new quirk on me, not return me." 𝐵𝑆T gave him a thoughtful look. "If you are unable to return our quirks, what are your plans for us?" Before 𝐲𝐻𝐬 could respond, his uncle turned and looked at the three heroes still standing there. "Well, that is just up to you then, isn't it? Either you stick around on your best behavior or you move on." 𝐲𝐻𝐬's hairs on the back of his neck immediately stood on end as he recognized that lilting speaking pattern that he had never heard from the man before. One that he had only ever heard through the mouths of two others, his father and Tamura after he had been possessed. 𝗵𝗏𝗏 glared at the man that 𝐲𝐻𝐬 had the sudden worry might not be who he thought he was. "And if we don't, what are you going to do about it? You said it yourself, no one can kill one another in here." 𝐲𝐻𝐬 was released from his dad's uncle's possessive grip. "Oh, and when did I say that? All I seem to recall was saying you couldn't kill me." Before the flame hero could backpedal from his mistake, All for one for all had crossed the distance between them with overclock and slammed his palm down on the man, exploding his chest open in a spray of blood as he used Kai's quirk. Before the other heroes could react, before 𝐬𝐻𝐬 could, Todoroki Enji's body fell at Hisashi Yoichi's feet and began to blur at the edges before he slammed his hand down on the floor and dropped the body down into the sea of lights below before returning the floor to normal. Mirko immediately lashed out with a snarl of anger at him only to miss as he used overclock to pivot around behind her. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 closed his eyes and forced himself back out of his quirk before immediately lurching to his feet and running for a toilet to throw up as another two souls flickered out inside his quirk. He vaguely registered the presences of his husbands following him from their bedroom to check on him as he quickly scrambled to grab a hold of fierce wings and wall it off away from the rest of his quirks. He pulled his newly redonned wings tight around himself as he began to violently sob as the truth of the matter hit him. He hadn't done anything that would have allowed a vestige to die after all. 3 of his close friends, 3 of his family, were dead because Yoichi had killed them. His uncle had killed his own husband. Except maybe he hadn't, because now 𝐲𝐻𝐬 couldn't help but worry that he had grossly misunderstood how one for all worked. "I need to talk with Dad. Now, 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸." Hitoshi gave his dad a worried look as his other dads half carried him out the front door of their cabin in the direction of his grandparents and Izuku's. Upon all of their return, his dad had pulled him into a quick hug, eaten a quick sandwich, showered, and finally declared that he was going to go pass out for a bit to sort through his quirks since he hadn't been able to even figure out what all he had stolen from the Namu over a month ago. That had been more than fair enough. So Hitoshi had retreated to his room and continued texting the class while he still had a signal since his grandfather had yet to restore the signal blackout. To be fair though, it was unlikely and any hero would want to go after them now. Class 1 official Todoroki. At Shinso, remind me when I next see you that I need to give you a thank you present to your uncle or my not dead brother Ashido. Wait, is your dad okay then? Todoroki, nope. Natsuo and I might throw a party to celebrate Shinso. In other news, something is up with my dad. He just woke up from taking a nap to catalog his new quirks from the Namu back at the UST since apparently he couldn't do that while in Tartarus and started throwing up. My other dads are taking him to see grandfather now Ashida. Gross TMI Shinso. You two are still the only ones online. Kaminari. No, I am here too. I was not expecting to come back home from running to the store for snacks to finding out All Might and Endeavor are both dead. Like I was only gone for maybe 20 minutes and we no longer have the top 2 heroes. Shinso, make that top 4. Dad took both Hawks and Best Jeanist's quirks and Mirko's, but not sure anyone noticed that one since it is apparently unrelated to the rabbit thing Ashido. So what? 5 of the top 10 just gone. Kaminari. Dude, I just remembered Midoriya-sensei's speech at the start of our first day. He totally could have killed all of us if he had wanted to. Or stolen our quirks. Shinso, if it makes you feel better, I am pretty sure he is planning on giving back the pro hero quirks when things calm down some, or at least Best Jeanists. And Mirko's dad seems to like Hawks since he hasn't turned it off at all yet since he got it Todoroki. He can keep Hellflame, we don't want it back. Shinso, lol, pretty hard to give a quirk back to a dead guy. If dad doesn't end up wanting it, I might ask for it. Would be nice to have a better quirk for fighting since none of mine are all that good for it. Ashido, wait, you have more than one? Shinso, yeah, I was cloned from dad, so I got a shiny new copy of everything he had at the time except Erasure, since that mutated into brainwashing. That is the verbally mind control bit of my quirk. My threads are another quirk entirely called Black Whip. I also have Danger Sense, Float, Smokescreen, Gearshift and Fajin, and all for one of course. Kaminari. Dude, that is crazy. Todoroki, Gearshift and Fajin. Shinso, since they aren't obvious. Gearshift lets me control the speed of small objects and Fajin lets me stockpile kinetic energy through repetitive motions to release in bursts. Neither is very practical in combat, unless I use support items or I'm not going to be fighting for long. Ashida. You know, you probably shouldn't be telling us this since as heroes we are going to have to try and stop you eventually. Shinso, you're welcome to try. I am pretty sure our battle trials back at the start of the school year sort of proved I can kick your ass. Kaminari, you just caught me off guard. I know better than to talk to you now. Shinso, I don't really have to explain that one, do I? 𝐲𝗏 was vaguely aware of the fact he was using his husband's to keep upright as he slumped through the door into the other cabin across the way from his own, but right now, his focus was locked on his dad, who was now looking up from working on something on a laptop. 𝐲𝗏 met his eyes and stumbled forward. I need you to tell me exactly how One for All was made. Now, his dad's brows seemed to shoot up in surprise. I was under the impression you already knew the full story. What brought this about? He shoved the dining room chair nearest to 𝐲𝗏 out with his foot under the table. 𝐲𝗏 grabbed the back of the offered chair and fell into it. I think there is a chance we could have been wrong about what the quirk really is. How did you make it? His dad, seemingly curious as to where this was going, decided to humor him. It was made when the stockpiler I gave to my brother combined with the hidden quirk he carried without me knowing. But where did that quirk come from? All for One froze for just a tick before answering. It was created by the doctor copying the quirks of a few followers of mine to try and make the best version of that type of quirk. Why? Is it important somehow? 𝐲𝗏 somehow managed to pale further as his stomach plummeted at the likely confirmation of his fear. So you were the only one to hold the quirk before Yoichi did. How long did you have it? His dad frowned. Yes, but only for a little over an hour maybe. 𝐲𝗏, what is wrong? He vaguely registered Hisashi behind him ask a question through the ringing in his ears as everything clicked into place. As his new suspicion about the ghost of his uncle was likely confirmed, vestiges were ultimately just after images burned into a quirk. Sure, to be alive as one, they needed the spark of who someone was to power them, a bit of soul, but ultimately they are just the collective memories of their original holder. And Yoichi wasn't the original holder, just the first to hold it longer term. 𝐲𝗏 closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing as he struggled to fight back a panic attack as the pieces fell into place. As the twisted irony of the situation hit him, Yoichi was no more the original Yoichi than he was the original Aizawa 𝐲𝗏. They were the same, amalgamations of the younger siblings who overrode a weaker piece of their elder brothers. 𝐲𝗏 was not blind to his slight shift in personality and smaller habits following being sent back. How could he be with an audience that had remarked upon them so easily? As Deku, he had been prone to fits of muttering his thoughts aloud, and as 𝐲𝗏 he had never had any issues with the compulsive habit. Deku had been an optimist at his core, but 𝐲𝗏 was a realist, putting more weight on fact than emotional responses. Deku cried at the drop of a hat when stressed, but 𝐲𝗏 froze up and stopped breathing. So what was original to his real uncle and what was personality bleed from the tiny spark that had come from his dad? The spark that had combined with the memories of his brother to create a vestige that still thought of himself as purely Yoichi but clearly wasn't. Suddenly another realization hit him. Neither Katsumi or Toyami had noticed anything wrong with Yoichi. The bleed had started when he was still alive. He opened his eyes to see he had been relocated to the couch and was currently being crushed between his husbands as his dad watched him with a worried look from an armchair he had pulled up in front of him. 𝐲𝐴's mouth was dry when he spoke, not looking at either Hisashi or Oboro. I need to talk with my dad alone. His husbands both gave him worried looks, but did both eventually stand up to leave. Hisashi gave him a peck on the cheek. Just remember, we are here to talk to you too. 𝐲𝐴 closed his eyes with a bit of guilt for forcing them from the room, but now was not the time to explain the time travel bullshit that he had been avoiding talking to them about, knowing that the moment that damn holding back that information was all that was keeping him from spilling everything to them. I know, just not now, later tonight. With Hitoshi, Oboro gave him a reassuring squeeze. Later then, his dad watched the pair leave to likely guard the door to prevent someone walking in on them with a look of curiosity. However, before he could remark upon it, 𝐲𝐴 found his next words falling from his mouth in a rush to get the idea out of his head and onto the table. Dad, Yoichi didn't have a quirk. His dad blinked. Come again. 𝐲𝐴 gave a slightly panic-filled laugh. Dad, that stockpiler has stockpiled every single quirk that every holder has had. There was no secret quirk that he had. One for All learned how to transfer from holder to holder from All for One. If you had held the quirk for even longer, who knows what else it would have picked up. I could have been carrying copies of every single quirk that you had held at the time. His dad's eyes widened as the implications of that seemed to hit him. Your copy of All for One is actually a partial copy of my All for One. 𝐲𝐴 nodded. One that my own mutations in my genetics helped fill in the blanks most likely. It would explain at least why only the transfer on part of the quirk was available to the other holders, but I have access to the full quirk. What brought about this realization? 𝐲𝐴, still feeling rather ill, scrubbed at his face with his hands as if it was possible rub away the thoughts racing in his head. You know how quirks in a person's habits and personality are linked, right? How quirks sometimes lead to people developing major character traits that would help with the function of their quirk or as a result of them. Have you ever had issues with a quirk that you have been using a lot, bleeding some of the original holder's personality? His dad seemed to have to think that one over before a flicker of clear panic crossed his face. And if One for All copied my All for One before I gave it to him? Dad, did you notice any major shifts in your brother's personality between when you gave him the quirk and he died? His dad, now slightly green, nodded. While Yoichi had always been interested in heroes and things like that because of his comics, he didn't share my interest in how their powers actually worked until afterwards. Additionally, Yoichi's temper with me became shorter, and now looking back at it, how he acted with his husband falls more in line with my own possessive tendencies than his. He blinked as a look of clear worry flashed across his face. You think my personality in the quirk is bleeding into you now that you have started really using All for One? 𝐲𝐴 sighed and shook his head. No, not really. At least not in a way that would really affect me. All those sorts of traits are just as much mine as they are yours from how I was in the other timeline. No, if any quirk is affecting me, it would be danger sense, but outside of increasing my dislike of strangers, I don't really think that it has done much. 𝐲𝐴 carted his fingers through his hair. There is something I have been avoiding mentioning about how my quirk works. Dad, when you take a quirk, do you get vestiges of who they are as a person as well? 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Hisashi felt sick as his son explained just what was happening with his quirk, about the ghosts that he had been avoiding talking about since they had met, since they, reasonably, wanted little to do with Hisashi. As he explained his new suspicion that the Yoichi who had been a constant companion while he had grown up with for a second time was in all likeliness a piece of his own soul with his younger brother's memories slapped on top, of how that Yoichi had just murdered the vestiges of 3 pro heroes without even blinking and had likely done the same to those of the 2nd, 3rd, and 7th holders of One for All. 𝐲𝐴 was still shaking slightly, now in Hisashi's own grip, having moved during the explanation to wrap his own arm around his son, cocooning himself in his new wings. I can't hold on to fierce wings long term, not with the threat of Yoichi killing Hawk's vestige. As it is, I am not sure if I will be able to return either Mirko's or Best Jeanist's quirks without side effects in the wake of their vestiges being killed, and that is not even considering what I would do if he doesn't want it back. Hisashi gave his son a curious look. And why wouldn't he? I imagine that as a pro hero he would want his quirk returned so he could continue to try and help people. Dad, the man bolted the moment he heard my voice inside the quirk. It is possible that so long as we would be on enemy sides, he might be happier with the safety of an early retirement that the public wouldn't get upset with him taking. After all, someone quirkless could never be a pro hero. The venom with which his son spit out those last words set off alarm bells. That it sounded personal, which logically made no sense coming from 𝐲𝐴. If he had been saying something of the sort about villainous quirks, That would make sense, but quirkless. 𝐬𝐡𝐢, you are not telling me something else, are you? 𝐬𝐡𝐢 winced before he froze for a second and just sagged in his arms. I didn't mention it at first after you found out about the time travel because I was worried how you would take the news at the time. Back when, as far as I knew, I was the only one that was coming back from that other future. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 looked up from studying the floor to meet his gaze with a sigh. To put it bluntly, you fucked up when you sent me and Izuku back and we ended up in what had been each other's bodies. You cut a deal with my morning homeroom teacher to send him back to change things since you didn't know at the time that you had more than your one son, Midoriya Izuku, that you had just remembered. To be honest, I have no idea if sending me back was intentional or just something that happened because Aizawa-sensei had been holding my body at the time. Asashi felt his jaw drop slightly as so many little oddities that had always bothered him about 𝐬𝐡𝐢's and Izuku's explanation clicked into place, as did 𝐬𝐡𝐢's caginess with some of his explanations of things that had changed and Izuku's extreme bout of depression. Oh, well, he blinked. Should I be calling you Izuku then? 𝐬𝐡𝐢 thankfully grimaced at the thought. Dad, I have been Midoriya 𝐬𝐡𝐢 for far longer than I was ever Midoriya Izuku. As far as I am concerned, this is who I really am as a person. As for Izuku, I think he is more bothered by the change because of what he lost from that life and can't get back than actually being Izuku. After all, he has all the new memories of growing up as my younger brother like I gained his earliest memories before I started to change things. I am pretty sure he wouldn't have played along with my lie if he wasn't actually fine with being Izuku. Asashi felt a bit guilty that he was relieved by how casually 𝐬𝐡𝐢 said that as a statement of fact. So what sorts of things does Izuku miss the most? Maybe I could help since this is sort of my fault. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 snorted. One of the first things that Izuku was annoyed with me about after waking up was the fact I stole his husband, so, no, you aren't going to be able to do much about that. He isn't actually mad about it, just upset that now there is no chance of his old normal being the same again, even if on the whole he has admitted the new one is better. After all, 𝐴𝐻𝐻 died last time round right in front of him, and the chance of saving 𝐴𝐻𝐻 as well as his students was what made him agree to be sent back in the first place. I didn't even think about the implications of your relationships with your husbands. A worrying thought crossed his mind. Did you decide to date them because you knew your brother had? 𝐬𝐡𝐢 shook his head with a smile. No, Izuku and I just have similar taste in men. I honestly didn't even recognize Hisashi the first time we met and became friends with him before I found out the name of his quirk and put two and two together. He teaches under his hero name, not his civilian one, remember? Additionally, Izuku never got the chance to date 𝐴𝐻𝐻 when he was Aizawa, so obviously that is all me there. Hisashi found himself humming in thought. What about you? Is there anyone that you really miss from the last time around? Besides obviously the other All Might. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 seemed to consider that. My version of 𝐾𝐦 and my other former classmates from my year. A few of my upperclassmen. The other Sir Night-Eye and a little girl named Yuri that Aizawa and his Hisashi adopted but is still living with her biological family this time around since I prevented Chisaki from destroying her family from the inside like he did the last time. Saving her was admittedly at least in part why I was so harsh with Chisaki. She was basically my little sister since we all ended up living on campus after the other you and Tamura attacked my class specifically so many times. As the one who ultimately stopped Chisaki that time around, I was her personal hero and she liked to spend as much time with me as she could get away with. And she is okay still in this timeline. I might have stalked the boss of the Shy Hasekai a few times to be sure. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 blushed slightly. I am not afraid to admit that I inherited your possessive tendencies over people, even if I have no intention of vaulting real people. Hisashi felt the corner of his mouth tick up in amusement. Oh, not real people but vestiges maybe. 𝐬𝐡𝐢's blush increased. What do you think I did to Hawks to protect him from Yoichi? Hawks was not sure where he was, but at least he was somewhere away from the threat that was one for all now. He just wished it was somewhere a little less dull. Still, he was alone in the gray box and alone was safe. He could deal with a bit of sitting around in the boring room with nothing to do. It was nothing new to him after all. The commission had locked him up like this a few times when he was younger as punishment when he had been behaving unacceptably. He knew how to keep himself distracted. He was preening his wings when finally something changed and another figure appeared. It was only the man's casual dress of hero merchandise shirt, bright red sweatpants and slightly longer, messier hair that revealed him to likely not be one for all. The darker colored eyes further confirmed it. 10. Sorry about the vault. Yoichi killed the other three before I could get them away from him, and I sort of was caught off guard by his sudden level of aggression since I had never seen him like that before. Hawks frowned. But he killed the other vestiges of the holders of One for All. Yeah, but he did that sometime between when the USJ started and me waking up fully in Tartarus, and that was the first chance I had to enter my quirk to even figure out what happened to them. I thought up until then that the vestige of my brother Six had killed them before they got to him, and I had accidentally turned on PvP for all of them and not just the new quirks coming in. Hawks gave the man a weird look at the unfamiliar acronym. PvP. That got him an odd look in return. Player versus player. You know, like with video games? Hawks shrugged. Yeah, I have never gotten a chance to really try those out before. Ten frowned. That is actually slightly concerning. The only kid I have ever met who has never played a video game before was an abused 6-year-old. Even my son who was living on the streets before I found him had played some before. How on earth did you manage that? Next you're going to tell me you have no idea what Star Wars is? Hawks actually began to sweat at that. I'm, not great at pop culture references. Ten looked at him suspiciously. So the name Darth Vader means nothing to you? No, should it? Ten looked awestruck. Holy shit, you don't actually know. Literally half the major cities and several locations inside of them in Japan right now are named after places from Star Wars. Even people who have never even seen the original movies know who at least Darth Vader is. Sorry. Ten gave him an exasperated look. Don't apologize. I'm more mad about the fact that I had no idea I needed to help you until now. And here I thought it would be hard to find someone who had a worse childhood than Tamura, but at least he clearly had some sort of childhood. Ten sighed and rubbed the back of his neck as he shook his head. Sorry, we have gotten sidetracked. We need to figure out what I am going to do with you on the off chance I can't get you back to the other Hawks. Hawks brightened slightly at that. You are going to give me back. I am going to offer to in private to the other Hawks, yeah. Still, we should figure out a backup plan in case the other you doesn't want his quirk back. Hawks opened his mouth to dispute even to possibility of that happening when a realization hit him. That is actually a good point. I mean, as much as I want to say I would want my quirk back right away, knowing the moment I have it back I would have to try and fight you guys again is, well, honestly kinda terrifying. I mean, I don't even remember what happened. 1 second I am flying in with all might in my arms and the next I am in your quirk. Ten winced. My brother 9 struck you with a bolt of lightning that not only stopped your heart but gave you severe electrical burns and a seizure. You, frankly, were dead for a couple minutes before all for one restarted your heart and had my husband dump the other you outside a hospital. Hawks curled his wings in on himself. Yeah, you see why I might not want my quirk back right away. Ten nodded. I thought as much. Still, I can't exactly keep you in here for more than probably a couple days. After that I am not sure I would be able to hold my focus on keeping you apart for your safety. Do you have a preference between my brother 9 or my son to hold on to you? I can't exactly give you to either my dad or my brother Izuku for similar reasons as I can't hold you myself and no one else could safely hold you in addition to their own quirks. Hawks scratched his chin. Would there really be a difference? Ten nodded. Well, for starters, if I give you to Hitoshi, he will be able to return you himself later without outside help since he also has his own copy of All for One if needed. Also, you would be his only vestige he has since he hasn't kept any quirk he has borrowed while practicing using it. However, if 9 takes you, your vestige will go dormant and you won't have to worry about having to deal with anyone before we can return you. If you can return me. Ten shrugged. Yeah, if. Hawks considered the options, as lopsided as they were. Yeah, staying with your kid definitely sounds like the better option here by a lot, but should I be worried about him not liking me hanging around in his head? You wouldn't be bound to just inside his quirk, but no. Hitoshi has known for a while that he was eventually going to end up with vestiges of his own from our experimentation. You would not be a bad first one for him, even if it is not long-term. Hawks jammed his hands in his coat pockets, even though it could be. Ten gave him an apologetic look. For what it's worth, I am sorry if it is. If it had been up to me, your quirk would not have been stolen in the first place. You are a good hero and a good guy in general. You didn't deserve my dad completely destroying your life as you know it without warning like that. Not when you just had the misfortune of being teamed up with his real target. Hawks frowned. So he is really dead then too. All might. Ten sighed and nodded. To ensure I wouldn't try and save him like I did with Dad. They warped him away before I even reached the surface again. Hawks considered the man. But you didn't try and save 𝗵 at all. As someone who knows just how fucked up the Todoroki family is because of that man's decisions, no, I did not. Besides, I am pretty sure my brother 9 would have just immediately killed him again. He was extremely pissed off about the guy on Taoya's behalf. Taoya, 𝗵's eldest, who tried to commit suicide by burning himself alive with his own quirk as a kid. The only reason he is alive from what I was able to get from him after I found him was because he had a run-in with the doctor who brought him back. He has been doing better mentally since I introduced him to 9, who knows what having a powerful quirk that hurts you to use better than anyone is like. He is pretty close to the same age as you. It was a lot, and 𝗵 pushed him to it. Ten sighed. He went from putting all his attention and a ton of pressure to be the next #1 hero on Taoya only to flip overnight to refusing to do anything because he realized that Taoya's quirk had such bad backlash. For a kid that young, suddenly being ignored after all those years of being the center of attention was just neglect. Add to that his younger brothers were born not long after and he had a full mental crisis. And add to that the fact that in the wake of Taoya's death, 𝗵's treatment of his other kids only got worse. He sighed again. I know and understand his reasoning behind it, but after not only his eldest son had a mental breakdown, but his wife as well, he should have taken a fucking step back and realized just what the common thread between everything was. Endeavor was a good hero, but he was a piss-poor father and husband. Hawks really did not have much he could say to that. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Hitoshi looked up from his phone at a knock on his bedroom doorway to see the still clearly stressed form of his dad. Hitoshi, can I talk to you for a minute? He switched off his phone. Yeah, I thought we were having a talk later tonight though. His dad crossed the room to climb onto the bed beside Hitoshi and wrap his new wings around him. Yeah, but this is mostly unrelated and shouldn't take long. Would you mind if I pass you fierce wings? I am concerned for Hawk's vestige if he stays in my quirk. Apparently Yoichi has gotten more territorial, I guess, since the USJ. He killed the vestiges of all the new quirks besides Hawks, who flew away when he realized how much danger they were all in. Hitoshi considered the wings around him. Hawks definitely had a good quirk for combat, and I would get to keep the quirk. For now, I want to offer the actual Hawks a chance to take it back once things calm down some, but his vestige doesn't think it is likely that he would want his quirk back right away. Not while he would be pressured to try fighting us again at least. Hitoshi reread between the lines there. So he could keep the quirk if he could convince both versions of Hawks that they were better off with the new status quo. Okay, pass him over. His dad pressed all 5 fingers of one hand on Hitoshi's own wrist, and then there was a shift of sorts between them before he felt the wings. He pulled out of his dad's hug to move them from where they had been resting to his own back, noting that the ones settling closest to his spine were largely white instead of red, and some of the other radder-looking feathers he had seen earlier had also been replaced. What is up with the white feathers? His dad shrugged. My healing quirks apparently apply to the feathers of the quirk. It seems that if I had kept the quirk long-term, my wings would have been white instead of red like Hawks. Speaking of, I gave you one of the copies of Super Regeneration from the Namu as well. Curious, Hitoshi summoned one of the long primary feathers to his hand before snapping it. There was a tingling in his wing as the feather rapidly regrew. It was a dusty gray. I guess I am a pigeon and not a hawk then. His dad snorted and brushed the leading edge of the feather. No, you're an owl. You see how the feather is covered in little hooks? That is how owls fly so silently. Huh, neat. He studied one of the white secondary feathers. It looks like you are too. His dad hummed in agreement. I mean, it makes sense given that you are my son after all. Whatever there is about us that caused the change in the type of feathers would likely be rather consistent. So how did you know that about owl feathers anyways? Coda. As for why, you can wait until tonight for the explanation. After passing Hawk's vestige and quirk over to his son, 𝐲𝐸 reluctantly slunk back into his bedroom and threw himself back down on the bed. He had put it off long enough. He needed to talk with Yoichi. He closed his eyes and sank back into the quirk to the side of Yoichi, pacing with clear agitation. The amalgamation of his uncle and dad froze mid-step and spun to look at 𝐲𝐸 with a nervous look. I can explain. 𝐲𝐸 sighed and massaged his forehead. How much of my conversation with dad did you guys hear? None of it. When you vanished, Hawks, you cut us back off from the outside world. 𝐲𝐸 winced but nodded before walking over to fall into one of the open chairs. You killed Katsumi, Toyami, and Nana. Why? As Yoichi averted his gaze with a guilty look and cleared his throat. Technically, he only killed 𝐵𝐲𝐬 directly. 6 delivered the killing blow to Nana, and Kai killed Sansei, protecting me and 𝐬𝐡𝐤. 𝐲𝐸 felt his stomach sink. But why would he do that? Daigoro rubbed the back of his neck and gestured at 𝐲𝐸. Both 𝐵𝐲𝐬 and Sansei wanted you dead after you started taking quirks like you did back at the USJ. They saw you more as a danger to society than anything. You hadn't heard 𝐵𝐲𝐬 talking about you behind your back, but he really did not like you, even if he had been pretending that he did to your face. Basically, when he said we should have killed you back when you were a little kid, Yoichi fucking lost it and killed him. After that, it became obvious that Sansei agreed with him and Yoichi revoked his healing status. Before we got rid of him though, you took 6's quirk, and while we were distracted by him, he jumped in and 𝐬𝐡𝐤. Kai got him off of them while me and Yoichi dealt with 6, which is when Yoichi figured out he could use our quirks too, by the way. In Nana, 6 couldn't have killed her unless Yoichi revoked her protections too. None of them met his gaze. For a long moment no one spoke until finally Yoichi took a shuddering breath. 𝐲𝐸, she wanted to die. She asked too. Kai was going to do it for her to make it fast when 6 turned up. Instead she died getting 6 off of me. Up until that moment I was still in denial that I was the one in control, but when I healed and she didn't. 𝐲𝐸 felt his chest tighten. But why would she ask you for that? Why would she? His words cut off as he shattered. As it all hit him, 2 men he had viewed as basically his uncles had wanted him dead, and the woman who was basically a second mother to him had committed suicide without even saying goodbye. He found himself being wrapped up in several sets of arms as what was left of his phantom family came in to cocoon him in their arms. Shockingly, that included Kai, though he was quick to recoil again and shoved his hands in his pockets with an averted gaze as if to pretend he hadn't just done it, though the hives now painting his exposed skin gave him away. 𝐜𝐡𝐬 stood held in the arms of the other four for several more minutes as he recomposed himself. After a few more moments as they all pulled apart, he met Yoichi's gaze. "There is something else we need to talk about. I told Dad about you because I realized something important." Yoichi winced. "What could be so important that you thought that was necessary? That you were like me, the memories of one person combining and overriding another." Yoichi blinked. "Come again." "Yoichi, you were quirkless. There was no hidden transference quirk for the stockpiling quirk to combine with. The quirk just did what it did with every other holder of it and copied the quirk." Deku frowned. "But that makes no sense. If that was true, then Yoichi wouldn't be here and we would have been stuck with he cut himself off." "Wait, are you implying that Yoichi is actually a combination of his brother and himself? Wouldn't both Byaoji and Sensei have noticed something was off about him before if that was true?" 𝐜𝐴 shook his head. "Not if the bleed of personality started when he was alive, which it did. Dad didn't hold one for all for very long, so it didn't pick much up from him besides the spark of soul needed to create a vestige." "Yoichi, do you remember when you developed an interest in quirks? It was after you got yours right." Yoichi visibly paled. "Yes, I didn't think much of it. Hisashi used to ramble about his quirks around me all the time. I just assumed that I started to find them interesting from pure repeat exposure." "You think that was the bit of Hisashi I was carrying around, did that?" 𝐜𝐴 nodded. "Dad also mentioned that your temper got shorter after the fact, much like his own, and looking back at your relationship with 𝐬𝐻 was alarming for him in hindsight, since he is not sure just how much of your obsessive love was normal for you or if it was all Dad." Yoichi had gone deathly quiet at that. "So I am not Yoichi then?" "Not really," 𝐜𝐴 sighed. "Not purely, no, but I do think you are mostly him. Enough so that Dad would still call you Yoichi. You just have a bit extra that wasn't originally there, like I have a bit of the original 𝐬𝐻 in me. Regardless, you are still the only version of you that we know, so as far as I am concerned, you still are just Yoichi. I just had to tell you because you deserve to know." 𝐬𝐻 cleared his throat. "I am with 𝐜𝐴 on this one. As far as I am concerned, you are just as much the original as I am of Shinomori 𝐬𝐻. Like he said, the changes in your personality started while you were still alive and largely were not major ones obviously, or both you and your brother likely would have caught it sooner." That did seem to cheer him up some. Deku tossed an arm around Yoichi's shoulders. "Well, I personally have to say you are clearly better than your brother in every way, including looks and personality." As Yoichi flushed slightly as he shoved the other man's arm off and the other retaliate by wrapping him up in his arms tighter, 𝐜𝐴 was suddenly struck by Deguro's teasing grin and the realization that it had been more than a month since he had spent any time with them. A month following the permanent end of his uncle's marriage. He looked to the others for confirmation and was met with 3 mostly bored looks. "Right, so not a recent change then." He turned back to the pair and gave them a level look. "So when were you going to mention that the two of you were a thing now?" Both of them froze as if they had suddenly remembered that they were not in fact alone. Yoichi immediately turned bright red and hid his face in clear mortification, and Deku just gave 𝐜𝐴 a sheepish look. Sorry," Kai snorted and gestured at them. "They have been all gross and touchy-feely with each other since Yoichi had his mental breakdown after the dust settled with the USJ incident, but I am pretty sure they had been flirting with each other when Byaoji was not paying them much attention for years at this point." 𝐬𝐻 shook his head. "Oh, no, they definitely went further than just flirting, and it has definitely been going on for a lot longer than that. After all, someone took one look at the other and immediately called him an angel and blatantly asked if sex was just as good as a ghost as when we were alive." Okay, that threw 𝐜𝐴 a bit as Deku of all people turned red. At least both En and Kai looked slightly mystified by that fact as he was. Hakamata Tsunagu found himself feeling lost for the first time in decades. It was strange, touching the hospital bed sheets and pajamas and having to guess as to what they were made up of when for the vast majority of his life he would have just known. And from the other side of the building too. People, doctors and nurses mainly, kept startling him at their appearance. His passive sixth sense for fibers about him having long acted as a passive radar to the location of people around him now gone. He knew that this was what most people would consider normal. For him, it was terrifying. It was like he had been left blind or deaf. Wrong. It was so very wrong. He curled his legs up to his chest as he struggled to accept the change. He was not sure if he could. He needed his quirk back. Tsunagu didn't care what the price would be for its return. He couldn't live like this. Tsunagu blinked as that thought struck him. He couldn't live like this. If he couldn't be whole again, he would rather be dead. It was a horrible thought, but now that he had it, he couldn't not think it. He didn't want to die. He couldn't live like this. He stood up from his bed all the same and walked to the window. He absently noted that they had placed him on the top floor of the building where it was theoretically safer. There was little chance he would ever get his quirk back anyways, wasn't there? Izuku's stomach dropped as he read the news that Ada had just dropped in the class chat from his brother. 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭𝐈💂 had tried to commit suicide in the wake of the loss of his quirk, a quirk that his brother had only been planning on holding onto temporarily and had only taken so that the man wouldn't resist his removal from the fight so that everyone in the league could get home safely. Thankfully, the heroes of 𝐜𝐴TN who had been patrolling the hospital to guard the surviving heroes had spotted him before he could successfully climb out the window to jump, but it had been a near thing. He took a calming breath and closed his laptop. He left his room in search of his problem child. He started with the obvious and walked across the way to his cabin. Itachi opened the door to his polite knock. "You need something, Izuku, or are you looking for Toshi?" "Need to talk with 𝐲𝐴TN about giving 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭𝐈💂 back his quirk. Apparently the shock of the loss has made him extremely suicidal. He had to be sedated and moved to a hospital room without a window and is now under watch." Itachi visibly paled as Izuku spoke, clearly just as horrified as Izuku had been. He immediately moved out of the way and pointed in the direction of the main bedroom of the cabin. "𝐲𝐴TN is communing with the ghosts again. You'll have to wake him up." Izuku nodded and brushed past him. True to what Itachi had said, 𝐲𝐴TN was sprawled out on the bed with an arm tossed over his eyes, snoring lightly. Izuku gently shook him awake. "Wha? You need to give 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭𝐈💂 his quirk back ASAP. He just tried to kill himself because he probably assumed that you weren't planning on returning it." That jolted 𝐲𝐴TN fully awake and sent him scrambling to his feet. He rushed from the room and over to the one next door, starting Hitoshi, who Izuku noted was currently wearing Hawk's wings. As Izuku gave him a puzzled look, 𝐲𝐴TN held out his hand. "Phone." Hitoshi immediately handed it over and 𝐲𝐴TN quickly dialed. "EI, I need you to allow me to visit 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐈💂 to return his quirk." Mira nearly dropped his phone in surprise. It was an act that immediately caught the attention of everyone in the HPSC war room, as Nedzu had been jokingly calling it. 10. "Yes, it's me." The technicians in the room quickly switched his phone to speaker and likely started to try and trace it. "I'm sorry, but you want what?" "𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐈💂 just tried to kill himself because I decided to borrow his quirk for a couple days. I want to give it back before he can try again and succeed. I can't do that unless you let me get close to him. Not without collateral damage anyways, and I suspect that would aggravate the situation with his mental health further." Madam President cleared her throat. "And what do you want in exchange for this generosity?" 10 snorted. "I'm on speaker." "Yes. And for starters, could you tell whoever is tracing this call to knock it off? I don't want you getting any clever ideas like bombing my home. We have kids here that have nothing to do with this outside of having parents in the league. You are talking about your son and younger brother, correct?" "Not just them, but yes." When she gestured for the technicians who had stopped to continue working, Nedzu glared at her and them and made a clear gesture for them to stop. "Done. So a few of your new friends have kids then?" "All good, Nedzu. You're there too?" "Yes, as well as my brother 9. Madam President glared pointedly at Nedzu. "Does that offer of returning quirks apply to Hawks as well?" "Not right now, but that is more due to the fact I am not the one who currently has it." Mira blinked in surprise. "You're not?" "No, one of my other quirks had a bad reaction to it, so I had to pass it on to keep it from being destroyed. You will have to negotiate its return from my son at a later date." That made Madam President bristle. "You say that your son has nothing to do with anything, but he currently has at least one stolen quirk." "Possibly more." 10 snorted. "If he has more quirks than his own natural ones or fierce wings, then they are being loaned to him by league members temporarily. He lacks the quirk-giving compulsion to try and take more quirks, unlike myself and All for One." "Your father." "My dad. Gran Torino is my father. Now is there is time and place that you want to do this, or are you just going to call off the heroes guarding 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐈💂 long enough for me to pass his quirk back?" She gritted her teeth. "Can you give us some time to arrange something? So long as that if it takes long enough that he wakes back up, that someone informs him that I am actually going to give him his quirk back." "Done," Nedzu happily chirped. "Out of curiosity though, would you happen to know why the loss of his quirk would have elicited such a reaction from him? Given your own reaction in calling us, I assume that it is a rather unusually extreme reaction on his part. If I had to guess, it is because Fiber Master does more than let him control fibers but sense them as well. I essentially blinded him, and while even considering that fact his reaction is extreme, it is also completely understandable. Is that everything for now?" "I believe so." Nedzu didn't even bother looking at Madam President before answering. "I'll call back in a couple hours." He hung up. Nedzu turned cheerfully to Madam President. "It would seem we have a leak in the hospital." She glared at him. "We could have found him. Why did you stop the trace?" Nedzu bared his teeth. "Because, as 10 said, there are children involved. As the UA principal, I could not in good conscience allow you to take any action that would harm them. One of them has All for One from the sound of it. Wouldn't it be far better to remove the threat before it becomes one?" Nedzu's fur was on end now. "Madam, are you telling me that killing an innocent child is acceptable for you?" Suddenly, Mira was struck by the realization that had Nedzu not already been on 10's side. that Madam President would have just shoved him over to it. If there was one thing Mira knew about Netsu was you did not fuck with his kids, and regardless of current circumstances, both Midoriya Izuku and Shinso Hitoshi were still considered his. Before he could cut in, one of the technicians piped up. "You know, I am more curious as to where he got Yokimaru's personal work number." That got Madam President's attention. "That is actually a good point." Netsu made an odd chittering noise that it took Mira a second to realize was probably what his real laugh sounded like. "That would be my fault. Ten used to help me coordinate with Yokimaru here to set up the UA classes for the provisional licensing exams when I was too busy to handle it personally. Given that the number hasn't changed since then and Ten's memory is borderline photographic, I am not terribly surprised that he remembered it." Mira blinked. He had not thought about that fact, given he had only ever spoken to the man maybe twice over the phone. "You think he has a quirk for that?" Netsu shook his head. "No, I believe it is likely a part of how All for One functions, or just natural genetics, which I suppose amounts to the same thing." All Might remarked once that All for One evidently had just as good a mind for detail. "I would have suspected it being an aspect of Overhaul otherwise, since he confirmed that he processes information faster with it active." Madam President shook her head. "We need to decide where we are going to do this so we can begin to get people in position to possibly trap and kill him after he returns Fiber Master. So long as he was telling the truth, we aren't risking Hawk's quirk being lost for good and could remove a major threat from the board." Mira was shocked that she missed the massive hole in that plan. "Yeah, and how willing would his kid be to return the quirk if we killed his father trying to do the same thing?" "Ma'am, regardless if he has the quirk or not, killing him would basically destroy any chance of getting it back." She sighed. "If that is true, then so be it. 10 is too large of a threat to just ignore. You could use UA if you wished. Since the school is still currently shut down because of your investigation, it would be empty of potential collateral, and perhaps the familiar location would lead him to lower his guard." Ei. Netsu followed him back up to the roof after he snuck off after the ambush planning really got underway. Mira gave him a questioning look. "Shouldn't you be in there getting information to pass along and warning about the ambush to 10? "No, that won't be necessary. I expect 10 to not only suspect the ambush, but be able to pick it out easily enough. UA is just as much his den as it is mine after all. He will spot anything out of place before they can do anything. Besides, I wouldn't put it past him to just borrow his husband's warp quirk for a couple minutes too." Mira shrugged. "Suit yourself." He took another gulp of his coffee and looked out over the city. "So do you know who they have in the hospital so they know to arrange someone new at the one they are probably moving Hawks to?" Netsu chittered. "Oh, the leak is not in the hospital, but from Ingenium, as unaware as he seems to be of the fact." Mira jerked round. "Come again." Netsu pulled out his phone, open to a group chat. "It seems that Class 1 are not abiding by the orders from the investigators to temporarily cease all contact with one another and have been chatting still with both Shinso and Midoriya despite everything. If I had to guess from the log, it would seem that after young Ada heard about the incident from his older brother, he immediately contacted the two of them to try and demand that 10 return the quirk out of concern for the hero." Mira skimmed the logs. "Do they know you can see this?" "Perhaps not all of them, but I am certain Midoriya and Shinso know. They do know, however, that 10 could join the chat at any point now that he has broken out, since Shinso has reminded them more than once that his father was the one to set up the chat." A thought struck Mira. "Wait, you're using these servers to talk with the League, aren't you? With Kurogiri and Reverb as well as the two boys?" "Most certainly. I expect it is only a matter of time before 10 messages me directly again." "You aren't worried that the investigators will find out?" Netsu flashed his teeth in a predatory grin. "They can't find out about something they can't look at. I am the one officially in charge of monitoring the UA class and staff chats after all." Mira's jaw dropped. "Holy shit, we are actually going to get away with this." "But of course, 10 and I have been planning the downfall of the HPSC for over a decade now after all. Even if he might not have realized I was serious." Mira studied the devil he had inadvertently made a deal with. "And what comes next? World conquest?" Netsu laughed again. "Oh, neither of us care for that amount of work. We will stop after he takes Japan and the school system here. Just the schools. But of course, children are our future after all." Tsunagu knew he had made a mistake trying to jump. That had been made perfectly clear to him by the heroes that had pulled him away from the window as he had begun to climb out. Made clearer still by the doctors that had been forced to sedate him as he fought to keep trying. Made completely concrete with the revelation that 10 had been always planning on returning his quirk to him. It was embarrassing how badly he had found himself overreacting in hindsight. Embarrassing to feel the looks of pity and concern he now got. Embarrassing that he now was no longer allowed any form of privacy while now under suicide watch. It was, however, slightly relieving that his own complete mental breakdown had forced the Commission to formally remove him from everything related to the case linked to 10 and All for One. that, even once his quirk was returned, he was going to continue his medical leave of absence for at least another full month or maybe even longer pending the results of his mental evaluation at the end of it, that he would be passed over for the new position of number 1 as a result if Hawks couldn't take the position himself. Over the past few days since he had lost his quirk and subsequently tried to kill himself, he had had a lot of time to reflect, to think back over his life as a hero. As a result, he had come to the unfortunate realization that this wasn't the first time he had made the active choice to engage in a form of self-harm, even if he had never tried something so blatant as that before. After all, while it was the job of heroes to save others, he had thrown himself in the way of danger to take hits meant for his fellow heroes more than once. Sure, he had never suffered a blow that ultimately did any long-term damage, but his core was littered in scars that could have easily been avoided. He was left wondering if his decision to immediately volunteer to help fight All for One to stop the breakout of 10 had been motivated purely by heroic duty as the number 4 pro hero, or if it had been a subconscious choice to try and get himself killed. Because, while he never would have admitted it aloud before now, he hated himself. Hated his looks that his PR team marketed to the masses as a model. He wasn't attractive. He was all long, awkward, spindly limbs and a far too long neck. Horribly thin, but couldn't be allowed to gain any weight or risk losing sponsors. Tsunagu knew if his meal plans were not so carefully curated for him that he likely would have an eating disorder from the stress of trying to stay in perfect model shape, that his physical health was in the hands of others, that someone else was counting his calories so he would keep his wiry muscles without risk of gaining too much fat. He was left wondering when the last time he had actually been happy with his life on the whole. When he graduated from UA, most likely. That wasn't to say he didn't like being a hero. God only knows at times helping people was the only good part of his day. But still, the fact remained, he was pretty sure he would be happier if he was dead, even when he got his quirk back. He knew he likely would never get a chance at it again. Not now that they knew to watch him. As he sat in the chair sitting comfortably outside in one of the fields at UA, he glanced up at the main building of the school with the knowledge that Snipe and several other sharpshooters had their guns trained on him to hit 10 when he finally appeared after his quirk was returned. He felt extremely exposed, dressed still only in hospital pajamas, his neck uncomfortably on full display. He rubbed at it unconsciously as he remembered how All Might had died. A broken neck. He wondered if it was All for One or 10 who had snapped it. He wondered if he asked if 10 would do the same to him. If it would be as painless as he had always been told it would be. Finally, the familiar shape of a warp gate melted out of the air in front of him and the long white-haired form of 10 stepped out. It was strange to see the man he was most familiar with dressing down in his old hero jumpsuit with his capture weapon around his neck, instead wearing a formal suit of all things, but he wore it well. The man's eyes held a large amount of guilt in them when Tsunagu's green met his dark near black. Hakamada, I'm sorry. I wouldn't have borrowed your quirk if I had realized how badly you would react to the possible loss of it. Tsunagu sighed and tilted his face to where he was pretty sure their audience couldn't see. There are snipers all around to take you out the moment you give me back my quirk. 10's mouth ticked up in clear amusement as he hummed in confirmation. Rather unfortunate for them that I recently developed a resistance to quirk suppressors and sedatives then, isn't it? As they should know from my stay in Tartarus, I can get shot quite a bit and recover. I suspect that if All Might had pulled the same stunt he did on my dad that nearly ended him on me, I would have recovered just fine on my own in basically no time at all. And wasn't that concerning for everyone else? Tsunagu sighed. I can't help but notice that you haven't given me my quirk back yet. 10 shrugged before angling his head so his hair acted as a curtain hiding his face from lip readers. I assume you aren't wired, since you wouldn't have made the effort to hide your lips from potential lip reading otherwise. Curious where this was going, he nodded. 10 smiled in return. A nice, pleasant one. Not one of his fake ones that he used to do when he had to deal with people he clearly had not liked, such as reporters. My son is currently breaking into the hospital you were staying at to talk with Hawks about his quirk. I am just making sure the commission's focus is currently fully here so he is safe on his first proper outing as a villain. So Hawks is getting his quirk back. Eventually. Honestly, we are hoping to find the doctor's lab first to try and make a copy of the quirk. My Hitoshi is rather attached to the idea of keeping it. Tsunagu blinked in surprise. You can do that. Make copies of quirks. The man shifted to straighten back up so that his lips could be red again. Not currently, but we know the doctor knows how to do it. One for All started as a quirk he created artificially after all, and my dad used to have him duplicate quirks for him all the time to stack effects to increase the power of the quirks. Unfortunately, he never took the time to learn exactly how it was done, so when the doctor ran, he took the knowledge of how to do it with him. I am starting to really understand why you were always so insistent that the doctor was the more dangerous threat than All for One. The implications of what that could be used to do are concerning, to say the least. 10 nodded. That is another reason I wanted to chat before I passed back your quirk. Since you should be taken off my case, I thought I would offer the idea for you to take over the investigation for him on the hero side of things when you are taken off medical leave. 𝐶𝐸 frowned. You are willing to give up potentially catching him yourselves. 𝐶 chuckled. It is funny you think I wouldn't know almost immediately after the heroes found him. 𝐶𝐸's frown deepened. So you do still have spies among the heroes? He cocked his head slightly. Oh, not just among the heroes. But all the same, how did you think I learned of your attempted suicide so quickly? The best part of it all is most of them have no idea that they are my spies in the first place. But some do. Only a small handful. Still, that is really all you need at times. It is a trick I learned as an underground hero actually. Networking. A friend of an ally is all you really need at times. He turned and smirked up in the direction of the snipers. Still, the HPSC should be more concerned about what comes next if they did actually succeed somehow in destroying me and my family. After all, nature hates a vacuum, and if we were to all exit the field at once, something far worse might crawl out of the gutters, just as I am sure that new true heroes will rise to the occasion to fill the hole: the loss of the top two, the crippling of the next two, and the complete eradication of the underground system. He turned back to 𝐶𝐸 to reach out with his hand, but 𝐶𝐸 was quick to grab it by the wrist to stop him from touching him with all 5 fingers, eliciting a frown. Before the man could question it, 𝐶𝐸 spoke quickly. Keep it. 𝐶's frown deepened. Hakamata, it would be a waste to give it back to me. I know. He took a shaky breath. If you give it back, I will just use it and take it with me. 𝐶 closed his fingers of his hand that 𝐶𝐸 held into a fist. When he spoke, it was quietly, as if 𝐶𝐸 was a scared animal of some kind. Though, that is why you had such a bad reaction to losing your quirk. You were already on the edge. I just gave you the final push. 𝐶𝐸 couldn't meet his eyes. Please, I know you could make it fast. I can't. 𝐶 ripped his hand free and cupped 𝐶𝐸's face with both hands as the knowledge of all the fibers around him came flowing back. His clothes were a cheap but durable cotton polyester blend. 𝐶's clothes were a clashing hodgepodge of materials: silk, linen, cotton, and wool. In the building overlooking them, Snipe was a beacon with his combination of denim, cotton, and wool among islands of cotton and linen. Then it was all gone again as 𝐶's eyes blazed red and his hair swirled up away from his face. I'm sorry, but I can't do that for you. If you really want to do it, I won't stop you, but I do want to ask you to reconsider. People are already hurting with the shock of the loss of the people they put their faith in to keep them safe the most, that I am afraid what will happen if they lose you too. I am not asking you to continue on like you are if you are really hurting that badly, but please at least try to hang on to life a little longer. If you can't fight for yourself, then fight for all the people who will miss you when you're gone. 𝐶𝐸 felt himself shaking as the tears welled up in his eyes. It hurts. A sob. I can't keep doing this. It hurts so much. Before he could blink, he was being pulled into a firm hug by the shorter man standing over him as he just completely broke down. 𝐶 made small soothing noises and told him it was okay on repeat as he carted his fingers through 𝐶𝐸's hair. As he sobbed, he was struck by the sad realization that he couldn't remember the last time someone had just held him. The last time someone had told him everything would be okay. Sadly, before he could really enjoy it, there was the horribly familiar cracking noises of guns being fired and 𝐶 blurred. Then silence again as 𝐶 stood casually beside him once more before opening his hand to drop a handful of bullets and glare up at the building. He sighed and looked back at 𝐶𝐸. I'm sorry, but I have to leave now. It seems that our time is up. Wait. 𝐶𝐸 staggered up to his feet to grab onto the man as he turned to leave. Don't leave. 𝐶 turned back to him and seemed to consider him for a beat before sighing and holding out a hand. Well, come on then. We can't stay here. 𝐶𝐸's heart soared for the first time in years as he took the man's hand and followed him into a new future, into a new hope. Hawks was strangely having one of the best days that he could actively remember. Okay, sure, he was currently stuck in a hospital bed and was sore pretty much all over, but for the first time in years, the HSPC was ignoring him and letting him do what he wanted for a change. Yeah, there was not much he could actively do right now, of course, but right now, there was no representative standing in the background disapprovingly as he relaxed. No one who had immediately called to make him stop as he downloaded a game on the phone that they paid for to yell at him for wasting his time. In fact, one of the other heroes who was helping guard the hospital had helped him find one he liked. The whole of 𝐸𝐸 was currently basically crawling all over the place, seemingly in the vague hope that since 𝐶 had seemingly always liked 𝐸𝐸, that he at least wasn't one of 𝐶's potential targets. As a result, the sidekicks and 𝐸𝐸 himself had turned up from time to time while on their breaks to chat and offer their condolences over what was likely the end of his career as a pro hero. That part was getting on his nerves a bit, that they viewed the loss of his wings as the end of everything. As if Hawks couldn't still take most of them in a fight if armed with a blade of some sort. Okay, sure, he would never be as mobile as he was used to, and he had lost a lot of his flexibility as to the types of heroics he could do, but he was hardly useless. That is why he decided that Star Racer was his favorite. The man, only a couple years his own junior, had seemed more insulted by the fact that Hawks didn't have any games on his phone than bothered by the fact that he was now quirkless. In fact, you should probably start thinking about a new hero name. Rebranding probably would do a lot to help with the public about the change. Hawks blinked as he looked up from the puzzle game that Star Racer had downloaded. What? The man shrugged and leaned back. I mean, you aren't planning on just giving up without a fight, right? It is not like losing your quirk erases all your hero training. Sure, you probably can't be an anchor hero anymore, but that doesn't mean I think you would kick my ass in a fight any less. It isn't like my quirk gives me that much of an advantage in a fight, as 𝐸 was so helpful in reminding me back when he was my teacher at UA. Hawks leaned back in the bed and considered the man. You were one of his students. Star Racer rolled his eyes. Please don't start accusing me of being a secret spy for him or some shit. I seriously doubt that any of the heroes he taught are secret villains at this point, especially with how pretty much every ally of his went to ground before he had even been arrested. Hawks had to admit, he had come to a similar conclusion himself a while ago, even if the commission had not agreed with his own assessment. Hawks offered the man a shrug. Sorry, I was just curious about what he was like to have as a teacher. Star Racer snorted. Fucking insane is what he was. Honestly, I am less surprised by the reveal that he was actually a villain this whole time than the fact that both Loud Cloud and Present Mike were. In hindsight, he wasn't exactly being subtle about it. Lord only knows how often he told our class, if I was a villain trying to kill you, you would already be dead. On the bright side, I am pretty sure at least I am not on the chopping block for my quirk getting nabbed, especially since he has your quirk now. My quirk would just be redundant. Before Hawks could finish opening his mouth to agree, he caught a familiar flash of red outside his window from the corner of his eye. His head snapped round to watch as one of his feathers wiggled the window latch from the other side. Wah! The latch popped open, and before Star Racer beside him could move, another couple feathers appeared to slide the window wide open before a figure with both intimately familiar and yet completely foreign wings dove through and crashed slightly on the floor with a curse. A figure with lavender hair. Hawks, frozen in complete confusion as to what he was seeing, was suddenly hit with a sense of annoyance. 𝐸 had given his wings away. Did he view them as useless because of some other quirk or quirks he had? Rude. The kid, because it was clearly a teenager, stood up and brushed himself off. Sorry, I am not used to flying that fast. My own quirks just let me glide slightly. Star Racer beside him blinked. What the fuck? Is that Hawk's quirk? What the hell happened to it? And more importantly, who are you and how did you get it? The lavender boy shrugged. A lot of his feathers got damaged when my uncle zapped him, so they ended up regrowing while Dad had the quirk. He gestured to the one gray feather that stood out like a sore thumb. I might have broken one too after Dad passed it to me. Anyways, I come in peace and all that jazz. I figured that since Dad is passing Best Jeanist his quirk back, I should probably talk to you about Fierce Wings. Hawks couldn't help but note that the boy hadn't referred to his quirk as his. Probably not a good sign about getting it back. On the bright side though, he had finally realized why the kid looked so familiar. Shinso Hitoshi, right, 𝐸's kid. The boy nodded and grabbed one of the chairs and sat down in it far too naturally to have just gotten the wings. It had taken Hawks years to learn how to shift them instinctually while sitting down in a back chair with arms, and he had seemingly done it without even thinking. That probably meant that the stolen quirks came with the trained muscle memories of the original holder. Hawks stiffened as that clicked, and he suddenly became painfully aware just how dangerous the kid was. He noted that Star Racer had followed his lead and stiffened up to move quickly if need be. He wondered if that was because he had also clocked the threat or because he had noticed that Hawks himself had. Yeah, so do you want the good news or the bad news first? Hawks narrowed his eyes. The bad news. While I am more than capable of returning your quirk to you right now, I am not going to for a while for your own safety. As things stand, the moment you get your quirk back, you would be forced to become the new #1 hero and would just be expected to fight my family again. We do not want to have to hurt you for just doing your job, so consider this as putting you through a forced vacation. But you are expecting that to change, Star Racer was quick to point out. Shinso nodded again. The wheels are already in motion for it. That wasn't good. He would have to pass that along after the kid left. And the good news, you will get the quirk back eventually. If you still want it, that is. There it was. You want to keep it. The kid didn't even deny it but shrugged. Can you blame me? It is a nice quirk. You aren't a bad headmate either. Okay, that threw him. Headmate. Whenever my dad or I take a quirk, it creates a vestige of the previous holder. A ghost of sorts made up of the memories of the person. Technically, it happens when my grandfather does too, but they are dormant for him except when he sleeps. Since I have fierce wings, I have a copy of you in my head now. Speaking of, he turned to Star Racer. Shimura, if you could be so kind as to educate this poor man. He had basically no childhood. He doesn't even know what Star Wars is, but like half the cities are named after planets from it. Hawks blinked in complete confusion as Star Racer blurted that out with clear shock. It quickly went downhill from there as the two seemed to go down lists of what they considered key cultural touchstones that he had no frame of reference for at all. After a couple of minutes they both seemed satisfied as Star Racer finished typing a list in his own phone. ☆ cracked a smile at the hero. You know, for the guy who destroyed all of Japan in the last timeline, you are not half bad. See you around, Shimura. As the boy jumped back out the window, Star Racer seemed to sum up his own thoughts on the matter. Wait, what? 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. 𝐲𝐷 glared back at his husbands as they gave him exasperated looks as the warp gate closed behind him and the now former pro-hero best jeanist. 𝐜𝐴𝐬 was looking around the place nervously and using his quirk to quietly unravel and reweave his formerly long-sleeve top to have a collar to cover the lower half of his face. Well, at least he wasn't actively trying to kill himself right now like he had threatened to do, so his little speech must have at least somewhat worked. Hitoshi came barreling through the other open warp gate and went into a rolling crash on the wooden floor with a sickening crunch that had 𝐲𝐷 running over to check on him in an instant. Hitoshi rolled over onto his side and shoved himself up, clutching the side of his head as there were a couple more sickening pops and his neck straightened back out. Before 𝐲𝐷 could even ask if he was okay, his son had turned to look at 𝗵𝗲. 𝗵𝗲, in the future, could you put the warp gate a bit higher up off the ground for me to come back through if the other one is in the air like that? I can't stop that fast. 𝐲𝐷 pulled Hitoshi in for a hug. Please don't do that in front of me again. I know I gave you a healing quirk, but please don't learn to relay on it for landings. Hitoshi made a noise of offense at that. Rude. I can land just fine. The ground was just too close for the speed and angle I had to use to come back through without the heroes catching me. As that best jeanist. The man in question shuffled from foot to foot awkwardly before considering both 𝗵𝗲 and Hisashi and blurting out, technically I am the artist formerly known as best jeanist. Hisashi immediately shifted from looking at him with an edge of suspicion to completely lit up before grabbing 𝗵𝗲's arm and excitedly pointing at 𝐜𝐴𝐬. 𝗵𝗲, he listens to our show. Best jeanist was one of our listeners. 𝗵𝗲 just gave 𝐜𝐴𝐬 a puzzled albeit relaxed look, though 𝐲𝐷 was uncertain how much of that the other man could pick up. So you are actually joining us. I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting you to be one of our supporters. 𝐜𝐴𝐬 shrugged. I wasn't, it is just. This is the complete opposite of what I have been doing. 𝐲𝐷 sighed. 𝐜𝐴𝐬 needed an out from his current life of some sort. It was either this or he likely would have made good on his threat of a more permanent change. It was clear from the way the three of them stiffened slightly and gave the man concerned looks that they knew exactly what he had meant by his careful wording. Hitoshi looked at the man carefully for a second before walking over and grabbing his arm. Come on, let's get you introduced to everyone. I'm sure you and Izuku will get on great. After the door to their cabin closed behind the pair as they walked out into the camp, both his husbands converged on him. 𝐸, I thought you said that you were just going to go and give back his quirk. 𝗵𝗲 gestured at the door. Yeah, how the hell did you manage to pull that off? I mean, I know you are good, but that seems plus ultra even for you. 𝐲𝐷 sighed and clasped onto the couch. He told me to keep the quirk and then asked me to kill him. Considering what I learned about Hawks from his vestige and that, I am beginning to think that the commission is actually actively abusing the heroes that make it to the top of the board. The poor man reacted like no one had told him that it would be okay at all in God knows how long. Add to that, the fact that some of the snipers that were there shifted to aiming to hit him following the poor guy having another mental breakdown from pressure, and I am not surprised that he has so little self-worth. Hisashi scratched at his chin and thought, you know, now that I think about it, I don't think I have ever heard any stories about him dating anyone. I always wrote it off as him possibly being ace or at least arrow like them, but if even All Might had rumors like that despite being a single Pringle his whole life involving his friends that he hung out with. What does that say about jeanist? 𝐜𝐴𝐬, 𝐲𝐷 corrected. Like he said, formerly best jeanist. 𝗵𝗲 walked over to the front window to look out of it. I think you are maybe right. He has never struck me as someone with a good work-life balance from the hours he was clearly working. But pause. Do you think Sako might be his type? Hisashi zipped over to the window to look out. Is he flirting with him? 𝐲𝐷 snorted and pulled himself back to his feet to follow them to the window. Is this the sort of stuff you got up to while I was gone? Gossiping about the league behind their backs and shipping them with each other? Hisashi gave 𝐲𝐷 an unrepentant grin and shrug. We used to do it at UA2 with Nem. It was always fun guessing who liked who and watching the drama unfold as they struggled to ask each other out. 𝐲𝐷 gave him a blank look. I feel I have to point out that I am the one who had to ask you out since you were too nervous to, and informed the two of you that we were engaged. You are the last person who should be throwing stones. As Hisashi gave a squawk of being insulted, 𝐲𝐷 did spot 𝐜𝐴𝐬 outside with Hitoshi, who was clearly going around introducing him to everyone. Oh, yes, it seemed clear, even from so far away and wearing his mask, that Mr. Compress was definitely eyeing up 𝐜𝐴𝐬 from his body language. Interesting. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Todoroki Ray paused on the threshold to what had once been her and Enji's home. For over a decade now, it had just been him and their children, but now, Ray could see a pair of shoes next to the door, untouched, too large to have belonged to anyone else. His spare raincoat that he rarely used on a hook above them. It looked like 𝐀𝐦 had just stepped out of the house for a minute or was out on patrol. Ray knew better. After all, 𝐲𝗏 would not have been able to pick her up to bring her home otherwise. Her baby boy paused and followed her gaze. "Mom, he isn't here to hurt you anymore." She broke. 𝐀𝐦 was gone.